Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into one of the most haunting mysteries in the Harry Potter universe. A secret that has troubled fans for decades, hidden beneath layers of magical politics and ancient protective spells. Why did Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard of his time, knowingly allow an innocent child to suffer for 17 long years? Picture this. A small boy, barely 2 years old, placed on a doorstep like an unwanted package. The most famous wizard in Britain watches from the shadows as that child disappears behind a door that will become his prison. For the next decade and a half, this boy will know hunger, isolation, and cruelty. He will sleep in a cupboard under the stairs. He will be denied love, denied his own identity, denied even the knowledge of his own miraculous survival. And through it all, the greatest wizard of the age watches. He knows. He sees. He could intervene with a single spell, a single word, but he doesn't. Tonight, we're going to uncover the hidden layers of ancient magic, desperate choices, and terrible sacrifices that shaped Harry Potter's childhood. This isn't just a story about neglect or oversight. This is about calculated decisions made in the highest towers of Hogwarts, about the weight of prophecy and the devastating calculations that even the greatest wizards must make when the fate of the world hangs in the balance. We'll explore the invisible magical infrastructure that surrounded Privet Drive, the network of watchers who documented every moment of Harry's suffering, and the secret meetings where his fate was discussed like a chess piece being positioned for the ultimate sacrifice. We'll discover how every adult in Harry's life was given a role to play in maintaining his isolation, his pain, and his desperate hunger for love and acceptance. But most disturbing of all, we'll uncover evidence that suggests Harry's suffering wasn't just a necessary evil. It was magically essential, that every moment of cruelty, every night of loneliness, every day of feeling unwanted, was carefully orchestrated to forge the weapon that would one day face the Dark Lord. So before we begin this journey into the shadows of Hogwarts' deepest secrets, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready to explore the darker corners of magical wisdom. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that haunt our favorite wizarding world. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing our global community of magic enthusiasts come together to explore these complex moral questions that make the wizarding world so fascinating. Now, get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights like the flickering candles of the Great Hall, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself for a journey that will forever change how you see the relationship between Harry Potter and the man who claimed to care for him above all others. Let's begin tonight's exploration into the heart of Dumbledore's most painful secret. Our story begins not in the familiar halls of Hogwarts, but in the sterile suburban world of Little Whinging, Surrey. It's here, on Privet Drive, that the most important magical experiment of the 20th century was conducted, not in a laboratory filled with bubbling potions and ancient tomes, but in a perfectly ordinary house where a perfectly ordinary family committed extraordinary acts of cruelty against a child they were meant to protect. The date was November 1st, 1981. Lord Voldemort had fallen, his body destroyed by the love of a mother who died to save her son. The wizarding world was celebrating, but in the office of the headmaster of Hogwarts, a different kind of magic was being planned. Ancient magic. Blood magic, the kind of protection that required sacrifice, not just from the one who cast it, but from the one who would be protected. Albus Dumbledore sat in his circular office, surrounded by the soft snoring of portraits and the gentle whirring of silver instruments whose purpose had been forgotten by all but him. In his hands he held a letter written in his own careful script, a letter that would seal the fate of a 15-month-old boy for the next 17 years. But as he sealed that letter with wax, as he prepared to place Harry Potter with relatives who had already shown their capacity for cruelty, Dumbledore wept, not tears of grief for the friends he had lost, though he mourned them deeply. These were tears of terrible knowledge. He knew what he was condemning Harry to. He knew because he had to know the magic he was invoking required complete understanding of the price being paid. You see, The protection that Lily Potter's death had placed upon her son was not simply a shield against Voldemort's magic. It was a living, breathing enchantment that grew stronger with suffering, that fed on the very emotions that Harry would be denied. Love withheld made the protection hunger, cruelty endured, made it powerful, and most importantly, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for others, forged in the fires of abandonment and abuse, made it unbreakable. This is the secret that has haunted the Harry Potter story from its very beginning. The boy who lived was not simply a survivor. He was a weapon, carefully crafted over 17 years of calculated neglect and precisely measured cruelty. Every night in that cupboard, every meal denied, every moment of feeling unwanted and unloved was not just tolerated by Dumbledore, it was required by him. And tonight, we're going to explore every terrible detail of how the greatest wizard of the age orchestrated the suffering of an innocent child, all in service of a greater good that demanded the ultimate price. The year is 2018. 37 years after that fateful Halloween night, when Harry Potter became the boy who lived. You are Dr. Helena Whitmore, a specialist in magical ethics and historical analysis, working deep within the restricted archives of the Department of Mysteries. Your task is one that the Ministry has kept classified for decades, to examine the true nature of Albus Dumbledore's decisions regarding Harry Potter's placement and upbringing. The room around you is unlike any other in the Ministry, located 7 floors below the Department of Mysteries itself. This archive exists in a state of perpetual twilight, lit only by the soft blue glow of preservation charms that keep the most sensitive magical documents from degrading. The walls stretch impossibly high, lined with filing cabinets that contain the private correspondence, memories and classified reports of the most powerful wizards in British magical history. On the mahogany desk before you sits a collection that would make any magical historian weep with joy. Dumbledore's personal pensieve, still containing dozens of his most private memories. Beside it, a stack of letters bound with phoenix feather string, each one marked with the Hogwarts seal. These are the documents that Dumbledore left behind specifically for this investigation, sealed with instructions that they not be opened until Harry Potter had reached full magical maturity and the immediate threat of Voldemort had passed. The air in the archive carries the scent of ancient parchment and the faint residue of powerful protective charms. Every breath you take seems to whisper with the weight of secrets that have been buried for generations. As you reach for the first document, a letter addressed simply to those who would judge my choices, you feel the familiar tingle of revelatory magic. These aren't just historical documents, they're confessions. Your investigation began 3 months ago when an anonymous tip reached the Wizengamot, suggesting that Dumbledore's handling of Harry Potter might have violated several fundamental laws of magical child protection. The tip came with a single piece of evidence, a photograph taken by a Muggle neighbor showing a severely undernourished boy being forced to do yard work in the blazing summer heat while his relatives lounged in the shade. The boy in the photograph was unmistakably Harry Potter, aged approximately 9 years old. But as you've delved deeper into the case, you've discovered something far more disturbing than simple neglect. The evidence suggests a pattern of deliberate orchestration, a careful maintenance of Harry's suffering that involved not just the Dursleys but a network of magical guardians who were specifically instructed to observe but not intervene. Your first breakthrough came when you discovered the existence of Mrs. Arabella Figg's detailed surveillance reports. Far from being a simple neighbor who happened to be a squib, Mrs. Figg was revealed to be a highly trained operative of the Order of the Phoenix, equipped with an extensive network of magical cats, whose enhanced senses could detect everything from Harry's emotional state to his precise nutritional intake. Her reports, filed monthly and sent directly to Dumbledore, painted a picture of systematic abuse that was not only documented but carefully monitored. The reports were clinical in their detail. Subject shows signs of malnourishment consistent with caloric restriction. Muscle development below normal parameters for age group. Emotional indicators suggest sustained psychological trauma, but most chilling of all were Dumbledore's handwritten notes in the margins. Acceptable parameters. Continue observation. Do not intervene unless subject's life is in immediate danger. As you lift the phoenix feather string and open the first letter, you realize you're not just investigating a case of child abuse. You're uncovering the deliberate creation of a weapon, forged in the fires of neglect and shaped by the careful application of suffering. The handwriting is unmistakably Dumbledore's, written in the flowing script that once graced countless Hogwarts letters, but the words contained within would shatter the image of the kindly headmaster forever. To understand my choices, the letter begins. You must first understand the nature of the magic that protects Harry Potter. It is not a simple shield charm or protective enchantment. It is a living sacrifice, renewed each day by the very conditions that cause him pain. The decision to accept this investigation came to you not through official channels, but through a moment of profound moral clarity that occurred in your own childhood. You too had been a victim of magical neglect, hidden away by parents who feared your early displays of accidental magic. The scars of that experience never fully healed, and when the opportunity arose to examine how the magical world's greatest hero had handled a similar situation, you knew you had to pursue the truth, no matter how painful it might prove to be. As you begin your systematic examination of Dumbledore's private papers, the first revelation comes not from his correspondence, but from his personal journal, written in a magical ink that only appears under the light of Phoenix flame. The entries begin in November of 1981, just days after Harry's placement with the Dursleys, and they reveal a man wrestling with the weight of impossible choices. The magic is already beginning to take hold, reads the first entry. The blood protection that Lily's sacrifice created is not simply a barrier against Tom's magic. It is a living enchantment that grows stronger with each moment of suffering that Harry endures while still choosing to love. Today I watched from beneath my invisibility cloak as he reached through the garden fence to pet a stray cat, his small hand trembling not from fear, but from the desperate need for any creature to show him affection. The magic around him pulsed with power in that moment, fed by his capacity for love despite his circumstances. The journal entries continue, each one documenting Dumbledore's regular surveillance visits to Privet Drive. Every few weeks he would arrive under cover of darkness, invisible to Muggle eyes, and observe Harry's daily life. The entries read like the field notes of a researcher conducting a long-term psychological experiment, noting how different types of deprivation affected Harry's magical development and emotional growth. But it's not just the clinical nature of the observations that disturbs you. It's the evidence of active intervention to maintain Harry's isolation. When a well-meaning teacher at Harry's primary school began to show concern about his home situation, Dumbledore quietly arranged for the teacher to be transferred to another school. When Harry began to form a friendship with a neighbor child who didn't fear his accidental magic, the family mysteriously moved away after receiving an unexpected job offer that was too good to refuse. The pattern becomes clear as you work through document after document. Every time Harry showed signs of developing a support system outside of his abusive home, that system was quietly dismantled. Every time he began to heal from his trauma, new sources of stress were introduced. The message was consistent. Harry Potter must remain isolated, must remain desperate for love and acceptance, must remain willing to sacrifice himself for others, which he had never learned to value his own well-being. Your investigation takes a darker turn when you discover the existence of the Privet Drive Protocols, a set of magical guidelines that governed how every adult in Harry's life was meant to interact with him. The document, signed by Dumbledore and witnessed by senior members of the Order of the Phoenix, reads like a manual for maintaining a child's psychological vulnerability. Under no circumstances should the subject be made to feel unconditionally loved or accepted. His willingness to sacrifice himself for others must remain absolute. Any display of true parental affection could compromise the protection magic and must be prevented through appropriate intervention. The protocols went beyond simple neglect. They required active psychological manipulation. Harry's relatives were to be kept in a state of constant resentment toward him, fed just enough information about the magical world to maintain their fear and hatred, but never enough to understand the true nature of their role. Meanwhile, the magical adults in Harry's life were given specific instructions about how to maintain emotional distance while still fulfilling their protective duties. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the section dealing with Harry's education at Hogwarts. The document revealed that even Harry's experiences at school were carefully orchestrated to maintain his psychological conditioning. His dorm mates were chosen specifically for their ability to accept him without becoming too emotionally attached. His professors were instructed to challenge him but never to provide the kind of mentorship that might help him develop genuine self-worth. As you delve deeper into the pensieve memories, you witness conversations that took place in the highest circles of the Order of the Phoenix. You see Minerva McGonagall arguing passionately with Dumbledore about Harry's placement, her voice breaking as she describes the reports she's received about his treatment. You watch as Remus Lupin begs to be allowed to take Harry in, only to be told that his lycanthropy makes him unsuitable, though you suspect the real reason is that Lupin's genuine love for Harry would interfere with the careful psychological architecture that Dumbledore was constructing. Most painfully, you witness Severus Snape's private meetings with Dumbledore, where the potions master's complex feelings about Harry are carefully manipulated to serve the greater plan. Snape's genuine desire to protect Lily's son is channeled into a role that requires him to be cruel to Harry in public while secretly ensuring his safety. The emotional torture that both Harry and Snape endure is revealed to be not an unfortunate side effect of their complicated relationship, but a deliberate feature of Dumbledore's design. The weight of these revelations settles over you like a heavy cloak as you realize the scope of what you're investigating. This isn't simply a case of one man making difficult choices in wartime. This is evidence of a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation, conducted against a child, orchestrated by the most trusted figure in the magical world, and carried out with the complicity of every adult who claimed to care about Harry's well-being. As you prepare to examine the next layer of evidence, you find yourself struggling with the same moral questions that clearly tormented Dumbledore himself. At what point does the greater good become indistinguishable from the greatest evil? How many children's lives is the world worth? And most troubling of all, if Dumbledore's plan ultimately succeeded in defeating Voldemort, does that success justify the means by which it was achieved? The archive around you seems to pulse with the weight of these questions, as if the very walls are holding their breath, waiting for your judgment. But you know that your investigation has only just begun. The darkest secrets of Dumbledore's plan still lie hidden in the depths of his memories, waiting to be uncovered by someone brave enough to face the truth about how heroes are made and what price the world demands for its salvation. The first major breakthrough in your investigation comes from an unexpected source. A hidden compartment in Dumbledore's desk, revealed only when you accidentally spill Phoenix tears from his pensieve onto the ancient wood. The tears, still warm with magical energy, seep into invisible runes carved into the desktop, and suddenly a drawer materializes that contains what can only be described as Dumbledore's most shameful secrets. Inside, you discover a collection of documents that transforms your understanding of Harry's placement with the Dursleys. These aren't the official records that the Ministry has on file, sanitized and edited to present the placement as a regrettable necessity. These are the raw intelligence reports, the unfiltered observations, and most damning of all, the rejected alternatives that reveal just how many better options Dumbledore deliberately chose not to pursue. The first document you examine is a comprehensive assessment of potential guardians for Harry, prepared by the Order of the Phoenix in the days following his parents' death. The list is extensive and heartbreaking in its implications. The Longbottoms, before their tragic fate, had volunteered to raise Harry alongside Neville. The Weasleys, despite their modest means, had offered to take him in. Even Hagrid, despite his half-giant heritage, had formally requested guardianship, supported by character references from a dozen prominent magical families. But beside each name, in Dumbledore's careful handwriting, are notes that reveal the true criteria by which Harry's guardians were selected. Next to the Longbottoms, too much love would interfere with necessary conditioning. Beside the Weasleys, excessive family warmth would compromise subjects' willingness to self-sacrifice. Even Hagrid's application was dismissed with the note, "Unconditional loyalty would prevent proper psychological development." The Dursleys, by contrast, received a glowing assessment not for their ability to care for Harry, but for their capacity to inflict the precise type of psychological damage that Dumbledore's plan required. Subjects demonstrate optimal levels of resentment and fear toward magical community, reads his evaluation. Their treatment of Harry will ensure maintenance of low self-worth while preventing development of healthy emotional attachments. Ideal for cultivation of sacrificial mindset. As you continue reading, the clinical nature of these assessments becomes even more disturbing. Dumbledore had conducted extensive psychological profiles of the Dursleys, documenting Vernon's deep-seated insecurity about his own masculinity and how it manifested as aggression toward anything he perceived as abnormal. Petunia's jealousy toward her sister was analyzed in detail, with specific notes about how her resentment could be directed toward Harry as a living reminder of everything she had been denied in life. Most chilling of all was the assessment of young Dudley Dursley, then only 2 years old himself. Subject shows early signs of developing into an ideal antagonist for Harry's psychological conditioning. Dumbledore had written, "Natural bullying tendencies, combined with parental reinforcement of anti-magical prejudices, will create optimal environment for target's development of protective instincts toward the innocent." The next set of documents reveals the extent of the surveillance network that Dumbledore had established around Privet Drive. Mrs. Figg's reports, which you had discovered earlier, were only the beginning. The entire neighborhood was under magical observation, with nearly a dozen operatives disguised as everything from street sweepers to postal workers. Each operative had specific instructions about what to observe and when to report, creating a comprehensive picture of Harry's daily life that would put even the most sophisticated intelligence operation to shame. The surveillance reports make for harrowing reading. They document not just the physical abuse, which was extensive, but the psychological manipulation that the Dursleys inflicted on Harry with what appears to be deliberate coaching. The reports describe scenes of Harry being denied food while being forced to cook elaborate meals for his relatives, of him being locked in his room during family celebrations, of him being made to do dangerous household repairs while being told repeatedly that he was a burden and a freak. But what makes these reports truly disturbing is not just their content, but their format. Each report concludes with a section titled Therapeutic Value Assessment, where the operative evaluates how each instance of abuse contributes to Harry's psychological conditioning. A report describing Harry being forced to live in a cupboard under the stairs concludes, "Confined living space reinforces subject's belief that he deserves minimal care and attention, excellent for maintaining low self-worth parameters." Another report, documenting Harry's first accidental magic incident at age 4, when he made his hair grow back after Petunia gave him a terrible haircut, notes, "Subject's instinctive use of magic in response to humiliation suggests strong survival instinct. Dursley's increased hostility following incident provides optimal reinforcement of association between magical expression and punishment." The surveillance network extended far beyond simple observation. The operatives were equipped with specialized magical devices that could measure Harry's emotional state, his magical energy levels, and even his dreams. These readings were compiled into monthly reports that tracked Harry's psychological development with the precision of a scientific experiment. You discover that Dumbledore had established what he called intervention thresholds, specific criteria that would trigger action if Harry's condition deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters. The thresholds were calibrated not to prevent suffering, but to ensure that Harry remained functional enough to fulfill his ultimate purpose. The documents reveal that Harry came close to these thresholds on several occasions, particularly during his early years when his accidental magic was most volatile. On one occasion, when Harry was 6 years old, he had been locked in his cupboard for 3 days without food after accidentally making the glass disappear at the zoo. The surveillance team reported that Harry's magical energy levels were becoming dangerously unstable, and his emotional state was approaching what they termed psychological break parameters. The intervention that followed was swift and subtle. Vernon Dursley received an unexpected bonus at work, improving his mood enough that he released Harry from his punishment early. But the most disturbing discovery comes when you realize that the surveillance network was designed not just to observe Harry, but to manipulate the Dursleys themselves. The operatives were equipped with mild influence charms that could subtly adjust the family's behavior to ensure that Harry's treatment remained within the carefully calculated parameters that Dumbledore had established. When the Dursleys showed signs of becoming too comfortable with Harry's presence, or when their treatment of him began to improve naturally over time, the operatives would introduce small stressors that would reignite their hostility. A mysterious car accident that would put Vernon in a bad mood for weeks. A series of minor mishaps that would be blamed on Harry's freakishness. Even Dudley's bullying behavior was carefully managed through subtle magical influence to ensure that Harry faced the optimal level of psychological pressure. The documents reveal that this manipulation extended to Harry's school experiences as well. Every teacher who showed Harry particular kindness was subtly discouraged from pursuing a closer relationship with him. Children who might have become true friends were influenced to maintain their distance. Even Harry's academic performance was managed to ensure that he achieved enough success to develop his capabilities, but never enough to feel truly valued or special. As you work through report after report, a pattern emerges that is both brilliant and horrifying in its execution. Every aspect of Harry's life was carefully orchestrated to produce a specific psychological profile, a young man who would possess extraordinary magical abilities and unshakable moral courage, but who would also believe himself to be fundamentally worthless. Someone who would fight passionately to protect others, but who would never believe that he himself deserved protection. The genius of Dumbledore's plan was that it created a perfect weapon against Voldemort. A person who was psychologically incapable of using power for selfish purposes because he had never learned to value his own welfare. But the cost of creating such a weapon was the systematic destruction of a child's capacity for happiness, self-worth, and healthy relationships. The final document in this section of the archive is perhaps the most damning of all. A letter from Dumbledore to himself, written in 1987 when Harry was 7 years old. The letter reveals a moment of profound doubt, where the headmaster questioned whether the price being paid was too high. "I watched Harry today through the window of number 4, the letter reads. He was sitting in the garden, having been sent outside while the family enjoyed a birthday celebration for his cousin, a celebration to which he was not invited. For a cousin who delights in tormenting him. As I watched, Harry began to sing quietly to himself, a song I recognized as one that Lily used to hum when she was nervous or sad. The melody was perfect, note for note, though he has never been taught music and has no memory of his mother singing it." The letter continues, "In that moment, I saw not the weapon I am forging, but the child I am destroying. I saw Lily's eyes in his face, and James's stubborn courage in the way he held his chin up, despite his tears. I saw the boy he should have been, could have been, if I had been brave enough to find another way." But then the letter takes a darker turn. "Yet even as I write these words, I know I will not change course. The prophecy is clear, and the stakes are too high. One child's happiness cannot be weighed against the lives of millions. History will judge me harshly for what I have done, but history will also thank me for the price I was willing to pay." As you finish reading this document, you realize that you've uncovered something far more complex than simple child abuse. You've discovered evidence of the most elaborate psychological manipulation in magical history, conducted by a man who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. The question that haunts you as you prepare to delve deeper into the investigation is not whether Dumbledore's plan was effective, but whether any goal, no matter how noble, can justify the deliberate destruction of a child's capacity for joy. As you process the shocking revelations of the surveillance network and the deliberately cruel placement with the Dursleys, your analytical mind begins to form what seems like a logical conclusion. Perhaps this is simply a case of utilitarian ethics taken to its most extreme form. Dumbledore, faced with the ultimate choice between one child's happiness and the survival of the wizarding world, chose the greater good. The abuse wasn't malicious. It was merely the unfortunate but necessary cost of ensuring that Harry would be protected by his mother's sacrifice. This interpretation allows you to maintain some semblance of respect for Dumbledore's character. He was a man forced to make impossible choices, someone who sacrificed his own moral comfort for the sake of humanity. The surveillance network, while extensive, was simply meant to ensure that Harry remained safe while the blood protection did its work. The psychological conditioning was regrettable, but it was the only way to ensure that Harry would be strong enough to face Voldemort when the time came. For several hours you allow yourself to believe this explanation. It fits the evidence you've discovered so far, and it allows you to sleep at night knowing that the wizarding world's greatest hero was still fundamentally a good man who made hard choices rather than a calculating manipulator who destroyed a child's soul for strategic purposes. The first crack in this comfortable interpretation comes when you discover a series of letters between Dumbledore and a wizard named Elliot Thornfield, a specialist in magical child psychology who had been consulted about Harry's development. The correspondence begins in 1985, when Harry was 5 years old and showing signs of what Thornfield diagnosed as severe developmental trauma. The child you've described exhibits classic symptoms of complex trauma. Thornfield wrote to Dumbledore. His inability to form healthy attachments, his tendency toward self-sacrifice, and his apparent comfort with physical pain all suggest that he has been systematically conditioned to view himself as worthless. While I understand that his current placement may be necessary for his physical protection, I must strongly recommend immediate therapeutic intervention to prevent permanent psychological damage. Dumbledore's response is polite but firm. I appreciate your concern for Harry's psychological well-being, but I must respectfully decline your recommendations. The conditioning you describe, while unfortunate, serves a greater purpose that you are not positioned to understand. The child's current psychological state is not an unfortunate side effect of his placement, but rather a necessary component of his preparation for the role he must eventually play. The correspondence continues for several months, with Thornfield becoming increasingly alarmed by what he sees as Dumbledore's indifference to Harry's suffering. In one particularly heated exchange, Thornfield writes, "Albus, I have known you for 40 years, and I have never seen you display such callous disregard for a child's welfare. Whatever greater purpose you believe this serves, you are destroying this boy's capacity for happiness, for love, for any kind of normal human relationship. The magical world may gain a weapon, but it will lose a human being." Dumbledore's final letter to Thornfield is chilling in its clarity. You speak of Harry's capacity for love as if it were something to be preserved for his own benefit, but I tell you that it is precisely because his capacity for love will remain intact, despite his suffering, that he will be able to accomplish what no other wizard could. A child who has been loved and cherished might hesitate to sacrifice himself for others. A child who has been denied love but retains the ability to give it will make that sacrifice gladly. The correspondence ends abruptly after this letter, and you later discover that Thornfield suffered a convenient memory modification that removed all recollection of his consultation regarding Harry Potter. The modification was subtle and expertly done, suggesting that it was performed by someone with considerable skill in mind magic. Your second major source of doubt comes from an unexpected source, the ghost of nearly headless Nick, whose testimony was recorded in a magical interview conducted shortly after the Battle of Hogwarts. As a ghost, Nick had access to areas of the castle that were warded against the living, and he had observed many private conversations that no one else knew about. According to Nick's testimony, he had overheard a conversation between Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall in the summer of 1991, just weeks before Harry's first year at Hogwarts. McGonagall had been reviewing Harry's academic records from his Muggle school and had become concerned about signs of neglect and possible abuse. "Albus," McGonagall had said, "Harry's teachers describe a child who is clearly intelligent, but who shows signs of significant nutritional deficiency and possible physical abuse. His medical records indicate multiple injuries that his relatives claim are the result of clumsiness, but the pattern suggests deliberate harm. We have an obligation to remove him from that environment." Dumbledore's response, as recorded by Nick, was revealing. "Minerva, I understand your concerns, but you must trust me when I tell you that Harry's current circumstances, while regrettable, are magically necessary. The protection that keeps him safe requires that he experience genuine suffering at the hands of those who are meant to care for him. If we remove him from the Dursleys, we risk losing the very magic that will ultimately save his life." But then McGonagall asked a question that would haunt you for the rest of your investigation. "Albus, are you certain that the protection requires his suffering? Or have you convinced yourself that his suffering is necessary because it serves your greater plan?" The silence that followed this question, according to Nick, lasted for several minutes. When Dumbledore finally responded, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There are some questions, Minerva, that are too dangerous to answer honestly, even to oneself. The third crack in your comfortable interpretation comes from a source you hadn't expected. Severus Snape's private notes, discovered in a hidden compartment in the potions classroom. These notes, written in Snape's characteristic precise handwriting, reveal a man who was increasingly troubled by his role in what he came to understand was an elaborate deception. The boy suffers," Snape wrote in one entry dated September 1993, "not just from the Dark Lord's attempt on his life or from the constant danger that surrounds him, but from something far more insidious. He has been taught to expect nothing, to value himself as nothing, to believe that his only worth lies in his willingness to die for others. I see it in his eyes when he looks at me with that familiar expression of resigned acceptance, as if he has already accepted that the world will always be cruel to him." The notes continue. "I begin to suspect that Dumbledore's plan goes far beyond simple protection. The boy's placement with his relatives, his isolation from the wizarding world, even his treatment here at Hogwarts, all seem designed to produce a specific psychological profile. We are not protecting Harry Potter, we are manufacturing him." The most damning entry comes from Snape's final year. "I understand now why Dumbledore was so insistent that I maintain my cruel treatment of the boy. It was not simply to maintain my cover with the Dark Lord, as I had believed. It was to ensure that Harry never developed the kind of healthy relationship with an adult that might interfere with his willingness to sacrifice himself. Every adult in his life has been assigned a role designed to maintain his psychological conditioning, and I have been as complicit as any of them." As you process these revelations, you begin to understand that your initial interpretation was not just wrong, but dangerously naive. This wasn't simply a case of choosing the greater good over individual welfare. This was evidence of a systematic program of psychological manipulation that extended far beyond what could be justified by mere protection magic. The comfortable narrative that you had constructed, where Dumbledore was a good man making hard choices, begins to crumble as you realize that the headmaster's actions were not reluctant necessities, but calculated strategies. The surveillance network wasn't just monitoring Harry's safety, it was actively managing his psychological development. The placement with the Dursleys wasn't just about blood protection, it was about ensuring that Harry would never develop the sense of self-worth that might interfere with his ultimate sacrifice. But even as this darker interpretation begins to take shape, you find yourself struggling with its implications. If Dumbledore's plan was truly as manipulative as the evidence suggests, then what does that say about the nature of heroism itself? Was Harry Potter's courage genuine, or was it simply the predictable result of 17 years of psychological conditioning? And if the conditioning was successful in creating the weapon that ultimately defeated Voldemort, does that success justify the means by which it was achieved? The archive around you seems to pulse with these questions, as if the walls themselves are struggling with the weight of the secrets they contain. You realize that you have reached a crucial juncture in your investigation. The comfortable interpretations are no longer sustainable, and you must prepare yourself to confront the possibility that the greatest wizard of the age was also its greatest manipulator. As you prepare to delve deeper into the evidence, you take a moment to reflect on the profound moral complexity of what you're investigating. The line between protecting a child and exploiting him has become increasingly blurred, and you begin to suspect that the truth you're seeking will be far more disturbing than anything you've discovered so far. The soft blue glow of the preservation charms seems to flicker around you, as if the magic itself is uncertain about whether these secrets should be preserved or destroyed. But you know that you must continue, no matter how painful the truth might prove to be. The wizarding world deserves to know the real cost of its salvation, and Harry Potter deserves to have his story told in full, regardless of how that story might change the way the world views its greatest hero. The deeper you venture into Dumbledore's secret archives, the more you realize that the psychological manipulation of Harry Potter was only the surface layer of a plan so complex and far-reaching that it defies comprehension. Your investigation now leads you into the restricted vaults of the Department of Mysteries, where the most dangerous magical research in Britain has been conducted for centuries. Here, in chambers that exist partially outside normal space and time, you discover evidence that Dumbledore's plan involved magical theories so advanced and morally questionable that they had been banned by the International Confederation of Wizards decades before Harry's birth. The vault you're examining tonight is designated Soul Magic Research, Classification Level Omega, and it requires both your blood and a memory of your most painful childhood experience to gain entry. The security measures alone should have warned you about the nature of what you would find inside, but nothing could have prepared you for the scope of Dumbledore's secret research into the darkest corners of magical theory. The chamber is circular, its walls lined with thousands of glass spheres containing what appear to be fragments of light and shadow. Each sphere is labeled with a date and a set of initials, and as you examine them more closely, you realize with growing horror that these are preserved samples of human souls collected from subjects who underwent various forms of magical trauma. The collection spans nearly 50 years of research, beginning in the 1930s when Dumbledore first encountered Tom Riddle and began to understand the true nature of soul magic. At the center of the chamber sits a massive desk carved from a single piece of what appears to be petrified phoenix wood. Its surface covered with research notes written in multiple hands and multiple languages. These are not Dumbledore's notes alone, but a collaborative effort involving some of the most brilliant and morally questionable magical researchers of the past century. Names that have been struck from the official records of magical history appear again and again: Herpo the Foul's modern disciples, researchers who studied the creation and destruction of Horcruxes, experts in the magical properties of sacrifice and suffering. The research they conducted was both groundbreaking and horrifying. They had discovered that the human soul possesses what they termed adaptive resilience, the ability to grow stronger when subjected to specific types of trauma. More disturbingly, they had found that this strengthening effect could be deliberately cultivated through careful application of psychological stress, creating souls that were virtually impervious to certain types of dark magic. The implications for Harry's treatment become clear as you read deeper into the research. The boy's suffering wasn't just endured for the sake of his mother's protection magic. It was actively cultivated to strengthen his soul against the piece of Voldemort that had attached itself to him on that Halloween night in 1981. Every moment of neglect, every instance of cruelty, every day of feeling unloved and unwanted, was carefully calculated to build up his spiritual defenses against the dark soul fragment that was slowly trying to corrupt him from within. The research notes reveal that Dumbledore had suspected Harry was a Horcrux almost from the moment he placed him with the Dursleys. The famous scar wasn't just a mark left by the killing curse. It was a wound in Harry's soul through which Voldemort's essence could influence him. The only way to prevent that influence from gradually corrupting Harry's essential nature was to ensure that his own soul remained strong enough to resist the darkness within him. But the methods required to achieve this spiritual strengthening were almost unthinkably cruel. The research showed that souls could only be strengthened through genuine suffering, the kind of deep emotional pain that couldn't be faked or simulated. Harry had to truly feel unloved, truly believe himself to be worthless, truly experience the depths of human cruelty, in order for his soul to develop the resilience necessary to contain and ultimately destroy the piece of Voldemort within him. The most disturbing discovery comes when you find a series of detailed psychological profiles that Dumbledore commissioned from experts in magical child development. These weren't the sanitized reports that appeared in official files, but brutally honest assessments of what prolonged psychological trauma would do to Harry's developing personality. The researchers had predicted with chilling accuracy exactly how Harry would turn out: brave to the point of recklessness, self-sacrificing to a fault, utterly devoted to protecting others while viewing his own life as expendable. Subject will develop an overdeveloped sense of responsibility for others' welfare, reads one report from 1987. This tendency will be reinforced by his isolation and his belief that he is fundamentally different from those around him. He will view himself as a weapon rather than a person, finding his primary value in his ability to protect others rather than in his own inherent worth as a human being. Another report, commissioned when Harry was 12 and had just faced Voldemort for the second time, notes, subject's willingness to sacrifice himself for others is now approaching optimal parameters. His experiences with the Diary Horcrux have strengthened his soul considerably, but more importantly, they have reinforced his belief that his primary purpose is to stand between innocent people and the forces of darkness, regardless of the cost to himself. The research reveals that even Harry's friendships were carefully managed to support this psychological conditioning. Ron Weasley was chosen as Harry's best friend, not just because of his loyalty but because his insecurities would ensure that Harry would always feel responsible for protecting him. Hermione Granger's inclusion in their group served a dual purpose. Her intelligence would help Harry survive the challenges he would face, but her Muggle-born status would also provide him with a constant reminder of the innocent people he needed to protect. Even Harry's romantic feelings for Ginny Weasley were anticipated and factored into Dumbledore's calculations. The headmaster understood that Harry would need something to fight for beyond abstract ideals, but he also ensured that Harry's sense of duty would always supersede his personal desires. The research notes include detailed analysis of how Harry's relationship with Ginny could be managed to maximize his motivation to sacrifice himself, while minimizing the risk that personal happiness might interfere with his willingness to die. As you work through document after document, you begin to understand the truly staggering scope of Dumbledore's manipulation. Every person in Harry's life, every challenge he faced, every moment of joy or sorrow was carefully orchestrated to produce a specific psychological outcome. The boy's entire existence was a carefully controlled experiment in creating the perfect weapon against the dark arts. A human soul so pure and so willing to sacrifice itself that it could destroy evil through the simple act of choosing love over self-preservation. But the most chilling discovery comes when you find evidence that Dumbledore had planned multiple versions of this experiment. Harry Potter was not the only child who had been subjected to this treatment. The research files contain profiles of dozens of other children who had shown magical promise, all of whom had been placed in situations designed to cultivate their willingness to sacrifice themselves for others. Most of these other subjects had failed to develop the necessary psychological profile, either because they had been rescued from their abusive situations by well-meaning adults, or because they had developed coping mechanisms that interfered with the conditioning process. But a few had succeeded, and their fates make for harrowing reading. Several had died in what appeared to be heroic sacrifices during various conflicts throughout the magical world, their deaths carefully orchestrated to appear noble and necessary while actually serving Dumbledore's broader strategic goals. The realization that Harry was not unique, that he was simply the most successful subject in a series of psychological experiments spanning decades, fundamentally changes your understanding of his story. He wasn't just a boy who happened to survive the killing curse and was subsequently protected by his mother's love. He was the product of a deliberate program designed to create human weapons capable of destroying the darkest forms of magic through their willingness to sacrifice themselves. This section of your investigation concludes with perhaps the most disturbing document of all, a letter from Dumbledore to his future self, sealed with instructions that it not be opened until after Harry's death. The letter, written in 1981 shortly after Harry's placement with the Dursleys, reveals the true depth of Dumbledore's cold calculation. If you are reading this, the letter begins, then Harry Potter has fulfilled his purpose and given his life to destroy the darkness that threatened our world. You may be tempted to feel guilt for the choices you made, for the suffering you allowed, for the childhood you destroyed in service of a greater goal. Do not allow yourself such indulgence. The letter continues, "The boy who died today was never truly alive in the way that other children are alive. From the moment Tom Riddle's soul attached itself to him, Harry Potter was no longer simply a child but a weapon waiting to be forged. The love and happiness that other children enjoy would have weakened him, would have made him hesitate at the crucial moment when hesitation would have meant the destruction of everything we hold dear. You gave him the greatest gift possible, the ability to save the world through the simple act of choosing to die for it. History will remember him as a hero, and history will be correct. But you and I will know the truth, that heroes are not born but made, and that the making of a hero requires the deliberate destruction of everything that makes a child human." As you finish reading this letter, you realize that you have uncovered something far more disturbing than simple child abuse or even calculated manipulation. You have discovered evidence of a systematic program designed to transform human beings into weapons, to strip away their capacity for personal happiness in order to maximize their usefulness as instruments of sacrifice. The peaceful interlude that follows your discovery of these documents comes as you step out onto the highest tower of the Department of Mysteries, where a small garden has been maintained for the mental health of researchers who work with the most disturbing magical phenomena. Here, surrounded by gently glowing flowers that bloom only in moonlight, you allow yourself to process the full horror of what you have learned. The night air is cool and clean, carrying the scent of magical blooms that sing softly in harmony with the movement of the stars above. For a few moments you allow yourself to simply exist in this peaceful space, to remember that there is still beauty in the world despite the darkness you have been exploring. The garden seems to pulse with gentle magic, offering comfort to those who have seen too much and learned too much about the prices that some people are willing to pay for the greater good. But even in this moment of tranquility, you cannot escape the weight of your discoveries. The stars above you seem to flicker with the same cold calculation that drove Dumbledore's choices, and you find yourself wondering how many other children throughout history have been sacrificed on the altar of necessity. Their stories hidden away in archives like this one, their suffering deemed acceptable because it served a purpose greater than their individual lives. Your investigation takes a profound turn when you discover that Dumbledore's methods were not original to him, but rather the culmination of magical practices that stretch back to the very foundations of wizarding civilization. Hidden within the deepest vaults of the Department of Mysteries, you find a collection of texts so ancient that they predate the written record of magical history, preserved through spells that have maintained their readability across millennia. These texts, written on materials ranging from dragonhide to crystallized phoenix song, reveal that the deliberate creation of sacrificial heroes has been a recurring theme throughout magical history. Every generation, it seems, has faced threats so terrible that ordinary courage was insufficient to meet them, and every generation has found wizards willing to forge human weapons from the raw material of innocent children, believing that the salvation of many justified the destruction of a few. The oldest text you examine is written in a form of magical script that predates even ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. its meaning revealed only through the application of translation charms, so complex that they require the combined power of 3 Department of Mysteries researchers to maintain. The text describes what its authors call the forging of the pure heart, a ritual process by which children born with exceptional magical potential could be shaped into perfect vessels for sacrificial magic. The ancient wizards had understood what Dumbledore would later rediscover, that the most powerful protective magic comes not from complex spells or rare ingredients, but from the willing sacrifice of someone who has retained their capacity for love despite being denied love themselves. But where modern magic tried to achieve this through careful psychological manipulation, the ancient practitioners were far more direct in their methods. Children selected for this forging process were taken from their families in infancy and raised in isolation, subjected to carefully calibrated levels of physical and emotional deprivation. They were taught that their only value lay in their willingness to die for others, that personal happiness was not just selfish but actively evil. The texts describe in clinical detail how these children were trained to find joy only in the act of sacrifice, to view their own suffering as evidence of their spiritual purity. But the most disturbing parallel to Harry's experience comes when you discover texts describing the cultivation of necessary darkness. Ancient magical theorists had understood that children destined to face ultimate evil needed to carry within themselves a fragment of that same evil, not to corrupt them, but to make them capable of understanding and ultimately destroying it. The texts describe rituals in which children were deliberately exposed to pieces of dark wizard souls, then subjected to precise psychological conditioning designed to ensure that their innate goodness would remain dominant. The success rate of these ancient programs was horrifyingly low. For every child who successfully developed into a sacrificial hero, dozens died during the conditioning process, their young minds unable to bear the weight of the darkness they carried or the trauma they endured. But the texts record these deaths with the same clinical detachment that characterizes Dumbledore's research, noting them as necessary losses in the pursuit of weapons capable of defeating threats to magical civilization. As you read deeper into these ancient accounts, you begin to understand that Harry Potter's story is not unique, but rather the latest iteration of a pattern that has repeated throughout magical history. Every few generations, when darkness rises that cannot be defeated through conventional means, the magical world produces a sacrificial hero whose willingness to die for others becomes the key to salvation. And behind every such hero stands a figure like Dumbledore, someone willing to bear the moral weight of creating such a weapon from the raw material of a child's innocence. The texts reveal the names of dozens of these manufactured heroes throughout history, children whose stories have been sanitized and mythologized until their true origins are forgotten. The boy who willingly entered the heart of a magical plague to stop its spread, dying in the process but saving thousands. The girl who walked into a dragon's lair knowing she would not return, her sacrifice somehow turning the beast's rage into protective magic for her village. The young man who stood alone against an army of dark creatures, his death creating a barrier that lasted for centuries. In every case, the historical records show the same pattern. A child marked by darkness from an early age, raised in circumstances designed to maximize their capacity for self-sacrifice, guided by mentors who claimed to love them while systematically destroying their ability to love themselves. The details change across cultures and centuries, but the fundamental methodology remains consistent. Perhaps the most haunting discovery comes when you find a text that describes what the ancient wizards called the prophecy cycle. According to this document, the prophecies that seem to guide the selection of sacrificial heroes are not predictions of natural events but rather magical constructs created by the very wizards who shape these children's destinies. The prophecies become self-fulfilling not because they foretell an inevitable future, but because they provide a framework for the deliberate creation of that future. The text suggests that Sybil Trelawney's prophecy about Harry and Voldemort was not a genuine glimpse into destiny, but rather the culmination of magical workings that Dumbledore had been conducting for decades. The prophecy gave him the justification he needed to proceed with his plan, but the plan itself had been developing long before the words were ever spoken. This revelation fundamentally alters your understanding of Harry's story. He was not simply a child who happened to fulfill an ancient prophecy, but rather a child who was deliberately shaped to fulfill a prophecy that had been created specifically to justify his shaping. The entire narrative of the boy who lived becomes not a story of natural heroism rising to meet supernatural evil, but an account of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation in magical history. The ancient texts also reveal the long-term consequences of this practice for magical society as a whole. Civilizations that relied too heavily on the creation of sacrificial heroes found themselves trapped in cycles of manufactured crisis and artificial salvation. The very ability to create such weapons made their leaders more willing to engage in conflicts that required them knowing that they possessed the ultimate solution to any magical threat. More disturbing still, the texts suggest that the process of creating sacrificial heroes gradually corrupted the societies that employed it. The casual acceptance of child abuse in service of the greater good led to a general devaluation of individual welfare, creating cultures where systematic cruelty became normalized as long as it served a perceived social benefit. The magical world's current indifference to the suffering of house elves, its tolerance for the brutal conditions in Azkaban, and its willingness to allow the Ministry to employ increasingly authoritarian methods all trace their roots back to this ancient acceptance of necessary evil. As you work through text after text, you begin to see the broader pattern of which Harry's story is only the most recent example. The magical world has been caught in a cycle for millennia, creating artificial crises that require artificial heroes, then using the existence of those heroes to justify the creation of new crises. Each generation's sacrificial weapon becomes the next generation's inspiration for producing an even more perfect instrument of necessary destruction. The historical accounts reveal that some societies managed to break free from this cycle, but only by fundamentally restructuring their approach to magical conflict. These civilizations developed forms of protective magic that relied on collective action rather than individual sacrifice, creating defenses that grew stronger through cooperation rather than through the destruction of innocence. But such societies were rare, and most were eventually conquered by cultures that had retained the ability to create sacrificial heroes. The texts suggest that the magical world stands at a crossroads in the aftermath of Voldemort's defeat. Harry Potter's survival of his own sacrifice has disrupted the traditional pattern, creating the possibility for a new approach to magical defense. But the same survival has also demonstrated the ultimate effectiveness of the old methods, potentially encouraging their continued use by future generations who face new threats. Your exploration of these ancient texts concludes with perhaps the most significant discovery of your entire investigation. A prophetic text that appears to have been written shortly after Harry's birth, describing what its authors call the last sacrifice. According to this prophecy, Harry Potter represents not just another iteration of the sacrificial hero pattern, but potentially its final expression. The text suggests that Harry's unique survival of the sacrificial process, combined with his retention of his capacity for love despite the trauma he endured, has created a new form of protective magic that could make future sacrificial heroes unnecessary. But it also warns that this transformation will only occur if the magical world chooses to acknowledge the true cost of its salvation and commits to finding better ways to defend itself against darkness. The prophecy ends with words that seem to speak directly to your investigation. When the truth of the weapon's forging is finally revealed, the world must choose between the comfort of necessary evil and the difficulty of unnecessary good. The choice they make will determine whether the last sacrifice truly ends the cycle or simply begins it anew. As you finish reading this ancient prophecy, you realize that your investigation has implications far beyond simply understanding Harry Potter's treatment. You are documenting not just the story of one child's suffering, but the culmination of a pattern that has shaped magical civilization for millennia. The evidence you are gathering could provide the magical world with the opportunity to finally break free from its dependence on manufactured heroes and artificial sacrifices. But you also understand that such a transformation would require the magical world to confront uncomfortable truths about its own history and its current practices. The same society that celebrated Harry Potter's heroism might not be ready to acknowledge that his heroism was artificially created through systematic abuse. The same leaders who benefited from his sacrifice might resist any changes that would make future sacrifices unnecessary. The weight of this responsibility settles over you like a heavy cloak as you prepare to delve even deeper into the evidence of Dumbledore's methods. You are no longer simply investigating a case of child abuse, but documenting the potential end of a cycle that has defined magical civilization since its earliest days. The stakes of your investigation have become nothing less than the future of how the magical world protects itself and treats its most vulnerable members. The soft glow of the ancient text seems to pulse with anticipation as you prepare for the next phase of your investigation, where you will uncover the most disturbing evidence yet of how deeply Dumbledore's manipulation extended into every aspect of Harry's life and relationships. The breakthrough that shatters your remaining faith in Dumbledore's moral compass comes from an unexpected source. A collection of letters hidden within the binding of a seemingly innocuous book on advanced transfiguration theory. These letters, written in a code so complex that it takes you 3 days to decipher, represent correspondence between Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel spanning nearly 2 decades. What they reveal is so fundamentally disturbing that it forces you to completely reconceptualize everything you thought you understood about Harry Potter's story. The correspondence begins in 1981, just weeks after Harry's placement with the Dursleys, when Dumbledore wrote to his old friend seeking advice on what he terms the optimization of sacrificial conditioning. Flamel, with his centuries of experience in advanced magical theory, had apparently been consulted about the most effective methods for strengthening a child's soul through controlled trauma. "My dear Nicholas," Dumbledore's first letter begins, "I find myself in need of your expertise regarding a matter of utmost delicacy." The boy carries within him a fragment of Tom's soul, as we suspected, but the situation is far more complex than we initially understood. The fragment is not simply a passenger but an active influence constantly working to corrupt the child's essential nature. Traditional methods of Horcrux destruction are impossible without killing the host, but I believe there may be another way. Flamel's response reveals the theoretical foundation for what would become 17 years of systematic psychological manipulation. The soul, like any magical essence, responds to stress by becoming more concentrated and resilient. If we can subject the boy to precisely calibrated levels of emotional and spiritual trauma, his own soul should strengthen itself sufficiently to overwhelm and eventually absorb the foreign fragment. But Albus, the level of suffering required would be extraordinary. We would essentially be torturing a child for nearly 2 decades. Dumbledore's reply shows no hesitation. The mathematics are clear, Nicholas. 1 child suffering against the destruction of our entire world. But more than that, the suffering will not be meaningless. It will transform Harry into something unprecedented in magical history. A human soul so pure and so strong that it becomes capable of destroying evil through the simple act of existing. His pain will have purpose, even if he can never be allowed to understand that purpose. The letters continue, documenting a collaborative effort to design what they call the Purification Protocol. This was not simply a plan to keep Harry safe while he grew up, but a comprehensive program to systematically remake his personality, his relationships, and his understanding of his own worth. Every aspect of his development was carefully calculated to produce specific psychological outcomes that would serve their ultimate goal. The most disturbing revelation comes when you discover that Harry's suffering was measured and quantified with scientific precision. Flamel had developed a series of magical instruments capable of detecting and measuring what he termed soul density. and these instruments were used to monitor Harry's spiritual development throughout his childhood. The Dursleys were provided with subtle magical guidance to ensure that their treatment of Harry remained within optimal parameters for soul strengthening. The readings from this month show excellent progress, Flamel wrote in 1987. The boy's soul density has increased by nearly 15% since our last measurement. His capacity for self-sacrifice is developing exactly as predicted, and his ability to love others despite being denied love himself grows stronger each day. However, I am concerned that he may be developing too much resilience. If he becomes too comfortable with his suffering, it may lose its effectiveness as a conditioning tool. Dumbledore's response reveals the chilling calculation behind even the moments of kindness that Harry experienced. Your concerns are noted and appreciated. I will arrange for periodic instances of hope and joy in the boy's life, carefully timed to maximize the psychological impact when they are subsequently removed. The contrast between brief happiness and prolonged suffering should prevent him from developing the kind of emotional numbness that would interfere with the protocol. The letters document how every positive experience in Harry's childhood was deliberately orchestrated and then deliberately destroyed. His friendship with a neighbor's cat was allowed to develop for several weeks before the animal was relocated, teaching Harry that emotional attachments lead to loss. A teacher who showed him particular kindness was transferred after just enough time for Harry to begin to trust her, reinforcing his belief that he was destined to be abandoned by anyone who might care for him. Even Harry's accidental magic was manipulated to serve the protocol's goals. The letters reveal that Dumbledore had placed monitoring charms on Harry that could detect when his emotional state was approaching the threshold for magical outbursts. When necessary, additional stresses were introduced to push him over that threshold, ensuring that his magic would manifest in ways that would frighten the Dursleys and lead to increased punishment. The incident with the snake at the zoo proceeds exactly as planned. Dumbledore wrote in 1991, Harry's natural parcel-tongue ability manifested under stress, providing him with a moment of connection and wonder that will make his subsequent punishment all the more psychologically effective. The Dursleys' terror at this display of magic will drive them to new levels of cruelty, which should provide optimal conditioning for the trials ahead. But perhaps the most shattering revelation comes when you discover that Harry's friendships at Hogwarts were not natural developments, but carefully orchestrated relationships designed to support his psychological conditioning. Ron Weasley had not befriended Harry by chance, but had been specifically prepared for that role through subtle magical influence extending back to his early childhood. The letters reveal that the Weasley family had been under Dumbledore's observation for years before Harry's arrival at Hogwarts. Ron's insecurities, his tendency toward loyalty, and his capacity for both friendship and jealousy had been carefully studied and, when necessary, magically enhanced to make him the perfect companion for Harry's psychological development. Ron's jealousy of Harry's fame serves our purposes perfectly, Dumbledore wrote to Flamel in 1994. It ensures that Harry can never become too comfortable with his status or too confident in his relationships. The periodic conflicts between them remind Harry that even his closest friendships are fragile, and that he ultimately stands alone in his destiny. Hermione Granger's role was even more calculated. Her intelligence and research abilities were essential for helping Harry survive the challenges he would face. But her personality had been subtly influenced to ensure that she would never provide him with the kind of unconditional emotional support that might interfere with his conditioning. Hermione's tendency toward intellectual superiority and rule-following creates exactly the right dynamic. The letters reveal. She provides Harry with the knowledge he needs while simultaneously reinforcing his feelings of inadequacy and his belief that he must prove his worth through heroic action rather than simply existing as a valued friend. The letters document how every relationship in Harry's life was similarly managed and manipulated. His romantic feelings for Cho Chang were allowed to develop specifically because they were doomed to failure, providing another lesson in the impossibility of personal happiness for someone in his position. His eventual relationship with Ginny Weasley was carefully orchestrated to provide him with something to fight for while ensuring that his sense of duty would always supersede his personal desires. Most disturbing of all, the letters reveal that even Severus Snape's complex relationship with Harry was not the result of the potions master's conflicted feelings about James Potter and Lily Evans, but rather a carefully constructed psychological manipulation designed to reinforce Harry's conditioning through a figure who represented both protection and cruelty. Severus serves as the perfect father figure for our purposes. Dumbledore wrote, "His protection of Harry is genuine, driven by his love for Lily, but his cruelty toward the boy is equally genuine, driven by his resentment of James. This combination ensures that Harry experiences both the longing for paternal approval and the pain of paternal rejection, keeping him in a constant state of emotional vulnerability that serves our greater purpose." The correspondence reveals that Snape's own psychological profile had been carefully studied and manipulated to ensure that he would play his role effectively. His guilt over Lily's death was deliberately maintained and nurtured, while his hatred of James was systematically reinforced through carefully orchestrated reminders of past humiliations. As you work through letter after letter, the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation becomes clear. He had not simply placed Harry in an abusive environment and hoped for the best. He had created an entire artificial reality around the boy, a carefully constructed psychological prison designed to shape every aspect of his development according to a predetermined plan. The letters reveal that even Harry's moments of genuine heroism, the actions that the wizarding world celebrated as evidence of his natural courage and goodness, were the predictable results of 17 years of psychological conditioning. His willingness to face the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets, his determination to save Sirius from the Dementors, his decision to compete in the Triwizard Tournament despite the danger, all of these choices were not expressions of free will but the inevitable outcomes of a personality that had been systematically programmed to value others' lives above his own. The boy's development continues to exceed our most optimistic projections, Flamel wrote in 1995. His response to Cedric Diggory's death shows that the conditioning has achieved its desired effect. Rather than being traumatized into self-preservation, he has become even more determined to sacrifice himself for others. The guilt he feels over Cedric's death will drive him to even greater acts of heroism, each one bringing him closer to the ultimate sacrifice that will save our world. The final letter in the collection, written just days before the Battle of Hogwarts, reveals the true depth of Dumbledore's cold calculation. The moment approaches when all our work will be tested. Harry walks toward his death, not because he has chosen to be a hero, but because we have systematically destroyed his ability to choose anything else. 17 years of carefully applied trauma have created exactly what we intended. A weapon that believes itself to be a person, a sacrifice that thinks it is making a choice. If our calculations are correct, his willingness to die will not only destroy the Horcrux within him, but will create a protective magic so powerful that Tom will never be able to harm another innocent person. The boy's death will end not just this war but the very possibility of such wars in the future. History will remember him as the greatest hero of our age, and history will be correct, even if the truth of how that hero was created must remain forever hidden. As you finish reading this final letter, you realize that you have uncovered evidence of the most elaborate and successful psychological manipulation in the history of magic. Harry Potter was not simply a boy who happened to develop into a hero through natural circumstances and personal choices. He was a carefully engineered weapon, created through the systematic application of trauma and conditioning, designed from birth to desire nothing more than the opportunity to sacrifice himself for others. The revelation fundamentally changes your understanding of every aspect of Harry's story. His famous courage was not an innate quality but a conditioned response. His loyalty to his friends was not natural affection but programmed behavior. Even his capacity for love, the quality that supposedly made him special, was the result of careful psychological manipulation designed to ensure that he would retain that capacity despite being denied love himself. The weight of this discovery settles over you like a shroud as you realize that the wizarding world's greatest hero was also its greatest victim. a child whose entire existence was sacrificed on the altar of necessity by the very people who claimed to care for him most. The comfortable narrative of good triumphing over evil through natural heroism and moral choice collapses, replaced by the far more disturbing truth of how heroes are manufactured and how evil can disguise itself as the greater good. The final piece of the puzzle comes to you in the form of Dumbledore's most secret pensieve, hidden behind wards so complex that they require the combined magical signatures of all 4 Hogwarts founders to access. This pensieve contains memories that Dumbledore never intended anyone else to see. Moments of such private shame and calculation that he kept them separate even from his other secret records. What you discover within these memories forces you to confront the most disturbing truth of all, that Dumbledore's manipulation of Harry Potter was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern of control that extended throughout the entire wizarding world. The first memory you examine dates back to 1943, when Dumbledore was still a relatively young professor at Hogwarts. In this memory, you'll witness his first encounter with Tom Riddle, not as the famous meeting in the orphanage that has been documented in official histories, but as a secret follow-up visit that occurred several weeks later. In this hidden meeting, Dumbledore does not simply observe the boy who would become Voldemort. He actively begins to shape him. The memory reveals Dumbledore conducting what he calls controlled corruption experiments on the young Tom Riddle. Rather than trying to save the boy from his dark impulses, Dumbledore carefully nurtures those impulses while simultaneously documenting their development. He provides Tom with access to restricted books on dark magic, introduces him to concepts that no child should know, and even arranges for him to encounter magical artifacts that will accelerate his descent into evil. The world will need a Dark Lord, Dumbledore explains to his younger self in a later memory, and Tom Riddle will serve that purpose perfectly. But more importantly, the world will need a hero capable of defeating that Dark Lord. And the hero we create will be shaped by the specific nature of the evil he faces. The memories reveal that Dumbledore had been planning Harry Potter's story for decades before Harry was even born. Tom Riddle's transformation into Voldemort was not a tragedy that Dumbledore failed to prevent, but a necessary component of a larger plan that required the existence of an ultimate evil to justify the creation of an ultimate weapon. The pensieve contains detailed records of how Dumbledore manipulated events throughout the First Wizarding War to ensure that the conflict would develop in ways that served his greater purpose. He allowed certain Death Eater attacks to succeed when they would increase public support for his methods. He prevented certain victories that might have ended the war too quickly, before his plans were ready to come to fruition. Most disturbing of all, the memories reveal that Dumbledore had advanced knowledge of Voldemort's plan to attack the Potter family on Halloween night 1981. Rather than warning James and Lily or providing them with additional protection, he allowed the attack to proceed, because he understood that Harry's survival would require the specific magical conditions created by his mother's willing sacrifice. Lily must die, Dumbledore explains to himself in one memory, and she must die willingly, believing that her death will save her son. Only under these precise conditions will the protection magic be strong enough to serve our purposes. James's death is regrettable but necessary to ensure that Lily faces the choice alone. The memories document how Dumbledore manipulated the circumstances of that fateful night with surgical precision. He ensured that James and Lily would be alone and vulnerable by feeding false information to their secret keeper through channels he knew were compromised. He arranged for Severus Snape to overhear the prophecy and report it to Voldemort, knowing that this would make Lily a target while also ensuring Snape's future loyalty through guilt and grief. Even the famous choice that Voldemort offered, Lily the decision to step aside and let him kill Harry, was not a spontaneous moment of mercy, but a carefully orchestrated element of Dumbledore's plan. The memories reveal that Dumbledore had been manipulating Voldemort's psychology for years, subtly encouraging his tendency toward dramatic gestures and his desire to offer his victims a choice between collaboration and death. Tom's ego requires that he be seen as merciful, Dumbledore observes in one memory. he will offer Lily the chance to live, which will make her subsequent choice to die all the more magically powerful. Her willing sacrifice combined with Harry's survival will create exactly the conditions we need for the protection magic to take hold. But the most chilling revelation comes when you discover that Dumbledore had prepared multiple backup plans in case the Halloween night scenario failed to produce the desired results. The memories reveal detailed contingency plans for artificially creating the conditions necessary for Harry's protection, including scenarios where Lily's death would be staged and her sacrifice would be magically simulated rather than genuine. The pensieve also contains memories from the years following Harry's placement with the Dursleys, showing Dumbledore's direct involvement in maintaining and escalating the boy's psychological conditioning. These memories reveal that Dumbledore did not simply observe Harry's suffering from a distance, but actively participated in orchestrating many of the worst incidents. You witnessed Dumbledore using subtle influence charms on Vernon Dursley during the man's worst moods, ensuring that his anger would be directed toward Harry in ways that would maximize the psychological damage. You see him manipulating Petunia's jealousy and resentment, feeding her carefully crafted information about the wizarding world that would increase her hatred of magic and, by extension, her nephew. The memories show Dumbledore personally overseeing the magical enhancement of Harry's cupboard under the stairs, not to make it more comfortable but to ensure that the space would have the maximum psychological impact. The cupboard was warded to amplify feelings of isolation and worthlessness, while also containing monitoring charms that allowed Dumbledore to track Harry's emotional state with scientific precision. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the memories reveal that Dumbledore had been directly controlling many of Harry's dreams throughout his childhood. Using advanced legilimency techniques, he had been planting nightmares and traumatic images designed to reinforce Harry's conditioning while he slept. These dreams were carefully crafted to appear natural while actually serving as a form of psychological torture that continued even when Harry was unconscious. The pensieve contains memories of Dumbledore's careful observation of Harry during his first years at Hogwarts, documenting how every challenge the boy faced was designed to reinforce specific aspects of his conditioning. The troll incident in Harry's first year was not a random attack, but a carefully staged event designed to bond Harry with Ron and Hermione while also testing his willingness to risk his life for others. The memories reveal that Dumbledore had personally arranged for Quirrell to be possessed by Voldemort, knowing that this would create the perfect first test for Harry's developing heroic conditioning. He had ensured that the protections around the Philosopher's Stone would be challenging enough to require genuine courage, but not so difficult as to actually prevent Harry from reaching his goal. Even the famous chess game that nearly killed Ron was part of Dumbledore's design, intended to teach Harry that heroism requires the willingness to sacrifice those you love for the greater good. The trauma of watching his best friend apparently die was meant to prepare Harry psychologically for the much greater sacrifices that would be required of him in the future. The second year's events were even more carefully orchestrated. Dumbledore had arranged for the Chamber of Secrets to be opened, knowing that the monster within would provide the perfect opportunity to test Harry's developing abilities, while also reinforcing his sense of isolation and difference from his peers. The memory of Tom Riddle preserved in the diary was not simply a Horcrux, but a specially modified version designed to provide Harry with specific information about Voldemort's past, while also traumatizing him in ways that would serve the larger conditioning process. The memories reveal that Ginny Weasley's possession was not an unfortunate accident, but a necessary component of Dumbledore's plan. Her suffering was deemed acceptable because it would motivate Harry to greater acts of heroism, while also providing him with a personal connection to Voldemort's evil that would make their eventual confrontation more psychologically devastating. The pensieve documents how Dumbledore's manipulation extended far beyond Harry to encompass the entire wizarding world. He had been secretly controlling key events and decisions throughout magical society for decades, creating the conditions necessary for his plan to succeed. The rise and fall of various dark wizards, the policies of the Ministry of Magic, even the social attitudes that shaped how the wizarding world viewed heroes and sacrifice, All of these had been influenced by Dumbledore's hidden agenda. The memories show him manipulating the Wizengamot to ensure that laws were passed that would support his methods while appearing to protect children's rights. He had arranged for certain individuals to be placed in positions of power throughout the magical government, creating a shadow network of influence that allowed him to control events from behind the scenes. Most shocking of all, the pensieve reveals that Dumbledore had been conducting similar experiments on other children throughout his career as headmaster. Harry Potter was not his first attempt at creating a sacrificial hero, but rather the culmination of decades of practice and refinement. The memories document at least a dozen other children who had been subjected to various forms of psychological manipulation, most of whom had failed to develop the necessary conditioning and had either been quietly relocated or had suffered tragic accidents that removed them from the program. The few who had succeeded in their conditioning had been deployed against various lesser threats over the years, their sacrificial deaths used to resolve conflicts that might otherwise have required more costly solutions. Their stories had been carefully edited and mythologized, turning them into inspiring legends that reinforced the wizarding world's acceptance of child sacrifice as a necessary component of heroism. The final memory in the collection shows Dumbledore in his office on the night before Harry walked into the Forbidden Forest to face Voldemort for the last time. In this memory, you witness the headmaster's final moments of preparation as he ensures that every element of his 17-year plan is in place for its ultimate test. Tonight, Harry Potter will choose to die, Dumbledore says to his reflection in the window. He will make this choice not because he is naturally heroic, but because we have systematically destroyed his ability to choose anything else. 17 years of careful conditioning have created a weapon so perfect that it believes itself to be acting from love rather than programming. The boy who walks into that forest tonight is not truly Harry Potter, but rather our greatest creation. We have taken a child and transformed him into the purest expression of sacrificial magic that the world has ever seen. His death will not just defeat Tom Riddle, but will create a new form of protective magic that will make future conflicts unnecessary. History will remember this night as the triumph of good over evil, of love over hate, of choice over compulsion. But we who forged this weapon know the truth, that the greatest good can only be achieved through the greatest evil, and that the purest love can only emerge from the most complete destruction of innocence. As this final memory fades, you find yourself sitting in the silence of the archive, surrounded by the weight of the most disturbing truth in magical history. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the chosen one, the wizard who saved the world through his willingness to sacrifice himself for others, was not a natural hero who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge. He was a carefully manufactured weapon, created through 17 years of systematic psychological torture, designed to desire nothing more than the opportunity to die for others. The comfortable narrative of Harry's story, the inspiring tale of an ordinary boy who became extraordinary through courage and choice, collapses entirely in the face of this evidence. In its place emerges a far more disturbing truth, that heroes are not born or made through natural development, but are forged through the deliberate application of trauma and conditioning by those who believe that the ends justify any means. The revelation forces you to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism itself, the price that society is willing to pay for its salvation, and the moral implications of creating weapons from the raw material of children's innocence. As you prepare to document your findings, you realize that you are not just investigating a case of child abuse, but uncovering evidence that could fundamentally change how the wizarding world understands its own history and its treatment of its most vulnerable members. The weight of your discoveries drives you to seek understanding from those who witnessed Dumbledore's actions firsthand, leading you to conduct a series of interviews with the surviving members of the Order of the Phoenix. These conversations, recorded in magical crystals that preserve not just words but the emotional resonance behind them, reveal a complex web of complicity, resistance, and moral compromise that extends far beyond what you had previously understood. Your first interview is with Professor McGonagall, now well into her 90s but still sharp as the day she first questioned Harry's placement with the Dursleys. The conversation takes place in her private chambers, surrounded by the fading portraits of former Transfiguration professors who listen with grave attention as she recounts the decades of moral struggle that defined her relationship with Dumbledore. "I knew," McGonagall admits, her voice carrying the weight of 40 years of guilt. "Perhaps not the full extent of Albus's manipulation, but I knew that Harry was suffering unnecessarily and that Albus was allowing it to continue for reasons that went beyond simple protection. I confronted him about it dozens of times over the years, and each time he would give me just enough information to quiet my conscience without revealing the true scope of his plan." The professor's testimony reveals that Dumbledore had been systematically managing the moral objections of his closest allies through a careful process of partial revelations and emotional manipulation. He would share just enough of his reasoning to make his actions seem regrettable but necessary, while withholding the information that would have revealed the true calculated nature of his choices. He told me that Harry's suffering was building character, that the boy needed to understand hardship in order to remain humble and compassionate. McGonagall continues. He spoke of the protection magic requiring genuine adversity, of the necessity for Harry to learn self-reliance. These explanations seemed reasonable at the time, especially coming from someone we all trusted so completely. It wasn't until years later that I began to suspect there were deeper layers to his reasoning. McGonagall's account reveals that she had attempted to intervene on Harry's behalf multiple times throughout his childhood, only to find her efforts mysteriously thwarted. Teachers who showed Harry special attention would suddenly be reassigned. Social workers who began investigating the Dursley household would inexplicably close their cases. Even her own attempts to visit Privet Drive were consistently prevented by circumstances that seemed natural but were, in retrospect, clearly orchestrated. The most painful realization, she admits, is that I allowed myself to be complicit because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. If Albus was truly the manipulative monster that the evidence suggested, then everything I believed about the war, about our cause, about my own actions would have been built on a foundation of lies. It was easier to trust in his goodness than to face the possibility that I had been serving evil disguised as the greater good. Your interview with Remus Lupin, conducted through a complex ritual that allows communication with the recently departed, provides an even more harrowing perspective on Dumbledore's methods. Lupin's spirit, anchored to the mortal plane by his profound regret over his failure to protect Harry, reveals details about the systematic isolation that was imposed on all potential support figures in Harry's life. "I begged Albus to let me take Harry after James and Lily died," Lupin's ethereal voice whispers through the magical medium. "I argued that my lycanthropy was a manageable condition, that I could provide the boy with love and stability while still maintaining the protection magic. But Albus was adamant that my emotional attachment to Harry would interfere with his development." Lupin's testimony reveals that Dumbledore had conducted detailed psychological profiles of everyone who had cared about James and Lily, identifying exactly which relationships might interfere with Harry's conditioning and systematically preventing them from developing. Sirius Black's imprisonment was not just a tragic mistake, but a convenient solution to the problem of Harry having a loving godfather who would have provided the emotional support that Dumbledore's plan required him to be denied. When Sirius escaped from Azkaban, Albus's primary concern was not Harry's safety, but the risk that Sirius might provide him with the paternal love that would compromise his conditioning. Lupin continues, "Every interaction between Harry and Sirius was carefully monitored and managed to ensure that their relationship remained fraught with danger and uncertainty rather than developing into the stable, nurturing bond that Harry desperately needed." The interview reveals that even Lupin's own relationship with Harry was subject to Dumbledore's manipulation. His resignation from Hogwarts after Harry's third year was not simply a response to public pressure about his lycanthropy, but a decision influenced by Dumbledore's subtle suggestion that remaining close to Harry would be selfish and potentially harmful to the boy's development. I see now that Albus systematically removed everyone who might have loved Harry unconditionally. Lupin's spirit laments. He understood that genuine parental love would have given Harry the self-worth and emotional stability that would have made him less willing to sacrifice himself for others. Every adult in Harry's life was assigned a role that served the conditioning process rather than the boy's actual well-being. Your most disturbing interview is with Severus Snape's portrait, hanging in a hidden chamber beneath the Hogwarts dungeons. Unlike the sanitized version of Snape that appears in the headmaster's office, this portrait contains the full personality and memories of the potions master, including his growing awareness of how thoroughly he had been manipulated by Dumbledore. I believed I was protecting Lily's son out of love for her, the portrait says, its black eyes burning with decades of suppressed rage. But I understand now that even my love for Lily was being used as a tool in Dumbledore's arsenal. He cultivated my guilt, fed my obsession, and directed my protective instincts in ways that served his plan rather than Harry's actual needs. Snape's testimony reveals the full extent of the psychological manipulation that had been applied to the adults in Harry's life. Dumbledore had not simply relied on their natural goodness and loyalty, but had actively shaped their emotions and motivations to ensure that they would play their assigned roles effectively. My cruelty toward Harry was not simply the result of my resentment toward James Potter. The portrait continues. Dumbledore deliberately triggered and amplified those feelings through subtle legitimacy and carefully orchestrated reminders of past humiliations. He needed me to be cruel to Harry, but he also needed that cruelty to be balanced by genuine protection, creating the perfect combination of rejection and salvation that would reinforce the boy's psychological conditioning. The portrait reveals that Snape had begun to suspect the true nature of Dumbledore's plan during Harry's final year at Hogwarts, when the headmaster's instructions became increasingly focused on ensuring that Harry would walk willingly to his death. The realization that he had spent years participating in the systematic psychological destruction of the child he believed he was protecting had driven Snape to a breakdown that he had carefully hidden from everyone around him. In my final weeks, I understood that I was not Harry's protector, but his tormentor, carefully managed and directed by a master manipulator who understood exactly how to use my own trauma and guilt as weapons against the boy I thought I was saving. Snape's portrait confesses, the memories I gave Harry before my death were not just information about Voldemort's Horcruxes, but my attempt to provide him with some understanding of how thoroughly we had all been used in service of Dumbledore's greater plan. Your interview with Arthur Weasley provides insight into how Dumbledore's manipulation extended to entire families who believed they were simply helping a friend of their son's. Arthur reveals that the Weasley family's financial struggles had been deliberately maintained through subtle economic sabotage, ensuring that they would remain grateful for Dumbledore's occasional assistance while also serving as a perfect contrast to Harry's wealth and fame. We thought we were providing Harry with a taste of normal family life, Arthur explains, his voice heavy with the weight of retrospective understanding. But I see now that even our family dynamics were being managed to serve a specific purpose. Ron's insecurities, Ginny's hero worship, Molly's maternal protectiveness, even Fred and George's humor, all of it was shaped and directed to provide Harry with exactly the kind of relationships that would reinforce his conditioning without providing him with the unconditional love that might have interfered with his willingness to sacrifice himself. The most heartbreaking testimony comes from Molly Weasley, whose maternal instincts had led her to try repeatedly to provide Harry with the nurturing care he so obviously needed. Her account reveals the systematic frustration of every attempt she made to truly mother the boy who had captured her heart. Every time I tried to treat Harry as one of my own children, something would happen to prevent it, Molly explains through tears that have been decades in the making. An emergency would arise that required him to return to the Dursleys, or new information would come to light about security concerns that made it unsafe for him to stay with us for extended periods. I thought I was facing natural obstacles, but I understand now that every barrier was deliberately placed to ensure that Harry would never experience the unconditional maternal love that he so desperately needed. Molly's testimony reveals that even her famous howler to Harry in his second year, sent after the flying car incident, had been suggested by Dumbledore as a way to reinforce Harry's belief that even the closest thing he had to a mother figure viewed him as a source of problems, rather than a beloved child. Your final interview in this section is with Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose position in the ministry had given him access to information about the broader political and social manipulation that Dumbledore had been conducting throughout the wizarding world. Kingsley's account reveals that the systematic creation of Harry Potter as a sacrificial weapon was only one component of a much larger program of social engineering that had been reshaping magical society for decades. Dumbledore wasn't just manipulating Harry's personal relationships, Kingsley explains. He was manipulating the entire social and political structure of our world to create the conditions necessary for his plan to succeed. Laws were passed, policies were implemented, cultural attitudes were shaped, all in service of creating a society that would accept and celebrate the sacrifice of children for the greater good. Kingsley's testimony reveals that the wizarding world's current attitudes toward heroism, sacrifice, and the treatment of exceptional children were not natural developments, but the result of decades of careful social engineering. Educational policies that encouraged children to view self-sacrifice as the highest virtue, media narratives that celebrated martyrdom over survival, even the structure of magical government that concentrated power in the hands of a few supposedly wise leaders. All of these had been influenced by Dumbledore's hidden agenda. The most insidious part of his manipulation was that he made us all complicit without our knowledge. Kingsley continues, every time we celebrated Harry's courage, every time we praised his willingness to risk his life for others, every time we accepted that children should bear the burden of fighting adult wars, we were reinforcing the psychological conditioning that Dumbledore had spent 17 years creating. As you conclude this series of interviews, you realize that you have uncovered something far more complex and disturbing than simple child abuse. You have documented evidence of the most comprehensive social and psychological manipulation in magical history. A multi-generational program that reshaped not just one boy's life, but the entire moral framework of wizarding society. The gathering of this testimony has revealed that Dumbledore's crime was not simply the destruction of Harry Potter's childhood, but the systematic corruption of everyone who cared about him, turning them into unwitting instruments of the very abuse they thought they were preventing. The web of complicity extends so far and so deep that it encompasses virtually every adult who played a role in Harry's life, each one believing they were helping while actually serving a plan that required his suffering. The accumulation of evidence creates a psychological weight that begins to affect not just your investigation but your fundamental understanding of reality itself. As you work through the final layers of documentation, you find yourself experiencing what psychologists call moral injury, the deep spiritual damage that occurs when you are forced to confront the systematic betrayal of everything you believed about justice, goodness, and the protection of innocence. The archive around you seems to pulse with malevolent energy as you delve into the most disturbing documents yet discovered. Dumbledore's personal research into what he called the architecture of necessary evil. These papers, written in his own hand but in a style stripped of all warmth and humanity, read like the theoretical framework for the systematic destruction of human dignity in service of utilitarian goals. The greatest obstacle to achieving optimal outcomes in crisis situations, one document begins, is the persistent human tendency to value individual welfare over collective survival. This tendency, while admirable in peacetime, becomes a dangerous liability when existence itself is threatened. The challenge for ethical leadership is to create conditions where individuals will voluntarily surrender their personal well-being for the greater good, while maintaining the illusion that they are acting from choice rather than conditioning. The paper continues with clinical descriptions of various methods for optimizing human resources through psychological manipulation. Dumbledore had studied the techniques used by totalitarian regimes throughout history, adapting their methods for magical application while maintaining the appearance of benevolent guidance rather than overt coercion. The key insight, the document explains, is that truly effective manipulation must be invisible to its subjects. The moment individuals become aware that their choices are being directed, they begin to resist that direction. Therefore, the most successful programs of behavioral modification are those that convince their subjects that they are acting from their own deeply held values rather than responding to external conditioning. The research reveals that Harry Potter was not Dumbledore's only experiment in what he termed heroic optimization. The documents describe dozens of similar programs conducted throughout the magical world over the past century, each one designed to create individuals who would willingly sacrifice themselves when circumstances required it. Most of these programs had failed, but the failures had provided valuable data that improved the methods used in subsequent attempts. The papers describe in detail the specific psychological techniques that had proven most effective in creating sacrificial heroes. Systematic isolation from genuine emotional support, carefully calibrated exposure to trauma designed to build resilience while maintaining vulnerability, and the cultivation of an overdeveloped sense of responsibility for others' welfare were identified as the core components of successful conditioning. But perhaps most disturbing of all is Dumbledore's research into what he called empathy weaponization, the process by which a person's natural capacity for love and compassion could be turned into a psychological weapon against them. The documents reveal that Harry's famous ability to love, the quality that supposedly made him special and gave him the power to defeat Voldemort, was not a natural gift, but a carefully cultivated vulnerability. The subject's capacity for empathy must be enhanced far beyond normal human parameters. The research notes explain. This enhancement is achieved through systematic exposure to others' suffering combined with the repeated message that the subject bears responsibility for alleviating that suffering. Over time, the subject develops a pathological need to protect others, even at the cost of their own well-being or life. The documents describe how Harry's exposure to other people's pain throughout his childhood and adolescence was carefully orchestrated to maximize this effect. His friendship with Neville Longbottom, whose own trauma served as a constant reminder of the costs of magical conflict, was specifically arranged to reinforce Harry's sense of responsibility for preventing similar tragedies. His knowledge of the fates of various Order members who had died fighting Voldemort was revealed to him in carefully timed installments designed to build his guilt and his determination to prevent further losses. Even Harry's connection to Voldemort through their shared mental link was not simply an unfortunate side effect of the Horcrux within him, but a deliberately maintained channel that allowed him to experience the Dark Lord's victims' suffering firsthand. The visions and nightmares that Harry experienced throughout his adolescence were not random intrusions but carefully curated experiences designed to reinforce his psychological conditioning through exposure to maximum emotional trauma. The research papers reveal that Dumbledore had been using advanced legilimency techniques to monitor and influence Harry's dreams throughout his time at Hogwarts, ensuring that even his unconscious mind was being shaped according to the requirements of the plan. The nightmares about his parents' deaths, the recurring visions of Voldemort's victims, even the prophetic dreams that seemed to provide him with crucial information, all of these had been artificially implanted to serve the conditioning process. Sleep represents the most vulnerable state of human consciousness, one research note explains. During sleep, the subject's psychological defenses are lowered, making it possible to implant suggestions and traumatic associations that would be rejected by the conscious mind. By carefully managing the subject's dream experiences over extended periods, it becomes possible to reshape their fundamental personality structure without their awareness. The documents reveal that this dream manipulation had been used not just on Harry, but on many of the other children at Hogwarts, creating a generation of young wizards whose psychological development had been subtly influenced to support Dumbledore's broader social engineering goals. Students who showed potential for leadership were given dreams that encouraged specific personality traits, while those who might have challenged the existing order were subjected to nightmares that reinforced their compliance and conformity. But the most chilling revelation comes when you discover Dumbledore's contingency plans for the period following Voldemort's defeat. The documents reveal that he had anticipated Harry's survival of the final confrontation and had prepared detailed protocols for managing the psychological aftermath of his conditioning. These plans treat Harry not as a person who had completed a heroic mission, but as a weapon that needed to be carefully deactivated to prevent it from becoming dangerous to the society it had been created to protect. The subject's conditioning will not simply disappear following the completion of his primary mission. The protocols explain, 17 years of psychological manipulation will have created deep-seated behavioral patterns and emotional responses that will persist indefinitely. Without careful management, the subject may experience severe psychological disruption as he attempts to develop a normal life after existing solely as an instrument of sacrifice. The deactivation protocols describe a comprehensive program of continued manipulation designed to ease Harry's transition from weapon to citizen, while ensuring that he would never fully understand the nature of what had been done to him. The plan included carefully orchestrated therapeutic interventions that would help him process his trauma while preventing him from recognizing the deliberate nature of his conditioning. Social support systems that would provide him with the appearance of normal relationships while maintaining subtle controls over his emotional development, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that he would never become a threat to the system that had created him. The subject must be allowed to believe that his suffering was meaningful and his choices were genuine. The protocols state, any revelation of the true nature of his conditioning would likely result in complete psychological breakdown or worse, the development of an adversarial relationship with the social order he was created to protect. Therefore, the deactivation process must reinforce rather than challenge the narrative of natural heroism and moral choice that has sustained him throughout his conditioning. The documents reveal that many of the positive experiences in Harry's post-war life, including his career as an Auror, his marriage to Ginny Weasley, and his role as a father, were not simply natural developments but carefully orchestrated elements of his ongoing management. Even his children were being monitored for signs of inheriting their father's unique psychological profile, with contingency plans in place to begin their own conditioning if they showed potential for becoming the next generation of sacrificial heroes. As you work through these final documents, you begin to experience a profound sense of disorientation and despair. The revelation that the entire framework of good and evil, heroism and villainy, choice and destiny that had defined the magical world for generations was actually an elaborate illusion created by the very people who claimed to represent the forces of light, forces you to question everything you thought you knew about morality and justice. The archive around you seems to darken as you realize the full scope of what you have discovered. This is not simply a case of one powerful man making difficult choices in extraordinary circumstances. This is evidence of a systematic program of social control that has been operating for generations, creating the very conflicts it claims to resolve and manufacturing the heroes needed to provide the illusion of hope and redemption. The weight of this knowledge settles over you like a physical presence, making it difficult to breathe or think clearly. You understand now why Dumbledore had gone to such lengths to keep these secrets hidden, not because they would damage his reputation, but because they would fundamentally undermine the psychological foundations upon which magical society had been built. The comfortable narrative of Harry Potter's story, which had provided inspiration and hope to millions of people throughout the wizarding world, collapses entirely in the face of this evidence. In its place emerges a far more disturbing truth, that hope itself had been weaponized, that inspiration had been manufactured, and that the very concepts of heroism and sacrifice had been corrupted beyond recognition by those who claimed to serve the greater good. As you prepare to document your final findings, you realize that you are not just investigating a historical crime, but uncovering evidence that could destabilize the entire social and political order of the magical world. The revelation that their greatest hero was actually their greatest victim, that their most trusted leader was actually their most successful manipulator, and that their most inspiring story was actually their most elaborate lie, would shake the foundations of everything that magical society believed about itself. The soft blue glow of the preservation charms flickers around you, as if the magic itself is uncertain about whether these truths should be preserved or destroyed. You understand now that you stand at a crossroads, not just in your investigation but in the history of the magical world itself. The choice you make about how to present these findings will determine whether the wizarding world continues to live within the comfortable illusion that Dumbledore created, or whether it confronts the terrible truth about the price that was paid for its salvation. The silence of the archive presses against you like a living thing, as you realize that the burden of this knowledge may be too great for any one person to bear. Yet you also understand that the truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be told, and that Harry Potter, wherever he is now, deserves to have his real story known, even if that story challenges everything the world believes about heroes, villains, and the nature of sacrifice itself. The final descent into the deepest vault of the Department of Mysteries requires you to surrender a piece of your own soul as payment for access, a security measure that ensures only those with absolute commitment to truth can witness what lies within. As the vault door closes behind you with the finality of a tomb's ceiling, you find yourself in a chamber that exists partially outside of normal reality, where the very air shimmers with the weight of secrets too dangerous for the ordinary world to contain. At the center of this impossible space sits a single object that defies comprehension: Dumbledore's true pensieve, carved from a substance that appears to be crystallized time itself. This is not the ornate basin that sat in his office for visitors to see, but the repository of his most fundamental memories, the thoughts and experiences that shape the very core of his being. The memories contained within this pensieve are not simply recollections, but living fragments of consciousness preserved in their original intensity and emotional weight. As you approach the pensieve, runes begin to appear on its surface, written in Dumbledore's own magical signature, but in words that seem to burn themselves into your retinas. For the one who seeks the ultimate truth, know that some knowledge carries a price beyond comprehension. The truth you seek will transform you as it has transformed me. Proceed only if you are prepared to lose your innocence forever. The first memory you enter transports you to a moment that predates Harry Potter's birth by nearly 40 years. You find yourself standing in a hidden chamber beneath Hogwarts that has never appeared on any map, watching a much younger Dumbledore as he conducts a ritual so ancient and forbidden that its very existence has been erased from magical history. The ritual is designed to split his own consciousness, creating multiple versions of his awareness that can operate simultaneously across different timelines and possibilities. "I have seen the future," Dumbledore explains to a figure shrouded in shadows, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that suggests he is speaking from a state of consciousness beyond normal human experience. Not one future, but thousands. In every timeline where we fight the darkness through conventional means, we lose. The evil is too complete, too clever, too willing to sacrifice anything for victory. The only way to defeat such absolute corruption is through absolute purity, and absolute purity can only be forged through absolute suffering. The memory reveals that Dumbledore's manipulation of events was not simply the result of careful planning and psychological insight, but was guided by actual knowledge of future possibilities gained through magical techniques that violated the fundamental laws of time and causality. He had not been guessing about the outcomes of his choices, but had literally seen the consequences of different approaches across multiple timelines. In the timelines where Harry Potter grows up loved and happy, he becomes a good man but not a great one. Dumbledore continues, his contentment makes him cautious. His happiness makes him value his own life too highly to risk it for others. He defeats some manifestations of the darkness but never addresses its root cause. The evil returns again and again, each time stronger and more cunning than before. But in the timeline where he suffers as I have planned, where his childhood is a carefully orchestrated nightmare designed to forge his soul into the perfect weapon, he becomes something unprecedented in magical history. Not just a hero willing to die for others, but a force of such pure sacrifice that his very existence begins to rewrite the fundamental laws that govern good and evil in our world. The memory shows Dumbledore studying what he calls the equation of ultimate sacrifice, a magical formula so complex that it requires the manipulation of reality itself across multiple dimensions of existence. The equation reveals that Harry Potter's story was not simply a plan to defeat Voldemort, but an attempt to permanently alter the magical laws that allow evil to exist in the first place. Tom Riddle represents the logical endpoint of selfish ambition, Dumbledore explains to his shadowy companion. He is evil in its purest form, completely divorced from any consideration for others' welfare. To defeat such absolute selfishness, we must create its perfect opposite, absolute selflessness, embodied in a person so willing to sacrifice everything for others that his very existence becomes a form of counter-magic that can unravel the foundations of darkness itself. The memory reveals that the true purpose of Harry's conditioning was not simply to make him willing to die for others, but to transform him into what Dumbledore calls a living sacrifice, a human being whose fundamental nature had been so completely altered that his continued existence would make it impossible for future Dark Lords to achieve the level of power that Voldemort had attained. The boy's sacrifice in the Forbidden Forest will not simply destroy the Horcrux within him, Dumbledore continues. It will create a permanent change in the magical field that surrounds our world, a transformation so profound that future generations will find it literally impossible to achieve the kind of soul-splitting corruption that has plagued our civilization for millennia. But the memory takes an even darker turn when you realize that Dumbledore's companion in this conversation is not a human being at all, but rather a manifestation of what he calls the necessity, a cosmic force that exists beyond good and evil, and demands the sacrifice of individual welfare for the preservation of universal order. The revelation that Dumbledore has been taking guidance from an entity that views human suffering as a necessary component of cosmic balance fundamentally alters your understanding of his motivations. The necessity demands equilibrium. The shadowy figure explains in a voice that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For every force of destruction that emerges in the universe, an equal force of creation must be forged to balance it. Tom Riddle's evil is so complete that it threatens to destabilize the fundamental order of existence. Only by creating an equally complete good can the balance be restored. But understand, Albus Dumbledore, that the creation of such perfect goodness requires the systematic destruction of everything that makes goodness comfortable or easy. The boy you shape must know suffering so complete that his choice to love others, despite that suffering, becomes a force of nature rather than a human decision. The memory continues to reveal the true scope of what has been happening not just to Harry Potter, but to the entire wizarding world over the past century. Dumbledore's manipulation of events, his careful orchestration of conflicts and their resolutions, his creation of sacrificial heroes and manufactured villains, all of it has been guided by his communication with this cosmic force that views individual human lives as expendable components in a larger equation of universal balance. The second memory you examine shows Dumbledore in the moments immediately following Harry's apparent death in the Forbidden Forest, as he experiences the full realization of what his 17-year plan has accomplished. But instead of grief or relief, Dumbledore's reaction is one of profound horror as he begins to understand the true consequences of what he has unleashed. The transformation is beginning, Dumbledore whispers to himself as he watches Harry's body lying motionless on the forest floor. The boy's sacrifice is creating exactly the change in magical reality that we predicted. But the scope of that change is far greater than I anticipated. We have not simply created a weapon to defeat one Dark Lord. We have fundamentally altered the nature of human consciousness itself. The memory reveals that Harry's willing sacrifice, combined with his survival of that sacrifice, has created what Dumbledore calls the empathy cascade, a magical phenomenon that is slowly spreading throughout the wizarding world and beginning to affect the emotional development of every magical child born after the Battle of Hogwarts. These children are developing with an enhanced capacity for empathy and self-sacrifice that mirrors Harry's own psychological profile. but without the trauma and conditioning that were required to create those traits in him. We have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams and failed beyond our worst nightmares, Dumbledore realizes as he observes the magical energies radiating outward from Harry's sacrifice. The next generation will indeed be incapable of the kind of selfishness that creates Dark Lords, but they will also be incapable of the kind of self-preservation that allows individuals to live normal, happy lives. We have created a world where everyone will be a potential martyr, where happiness itself will become a form of spiritual corruption. The memory shows Dumbledore frantically attempting to contain the magical energies that are reshaping human nature itself, but realizing that the transformation has already progressed too far to be stopped. His manipulation of one boy's psychology has triggered changes that will affect every magical person born for generations to come, creating a future where self-sacrifice becomes not a choice but an inescapable compulsion. I sought to create one perfect weapon, and instead I have poisoned the well of human emotion itself. Dumbledore confesses to the empty forest. The children of tomorrow will know only the desire to serve others, and the inability to value their own existence. I have solved the problem of evil by destroying the possibility of genuine individual happiness. The third and final memory is perhaps the most devastating of all, showing Dumbledore in his final moments of life. As he fully comprehends the magnitude of what his lifetime of manipulation has accomplished, the memory reveals that his apparent death from the curse on Marvolo Gaunt's ring was not an accident but a deliberate choice, his final attempt to escape the responsibility for what he had unleashed upon the Word. I have become the greatest Dark Lord in magical history, Dumbledore admits to himself as he lies dying in his office, surrounded by the portraits of former headmasters who listen in horrified silence. Tom Riddle sought to conquer the world through fear and domination, but I have accomplished something far more complete and terrible. I have conquered human nature itself, rewriting the fundamental code of consciousness to serve my vision of necessary good. The boy who walks these halls believing himself to be a hero is actually the carrier of a spiritual plague that will transform every magical person it touches. His very existence is proof that my methods work, that sufficient suffering can create sufficient virtue, and that knowledge will inspire others to replicate the process. I have not saved the world from the darkness. I have simply replaced one form of evil with another, more subtle and more complete than anything Tom Riddle could have imagined. The memory shows Dumbledore's final moments as he realizes that his communication with the necessity was not guidance from a cosmic force seeking balance, but manipulation by an entity that feeds on suffering and has spent centuries convincing powerful individuals to create elaborate systems of oppression disguised as salvation. His entire lifetime of work, his careful cultivation of sacrificial heroes, his systematic destruction of innocence in service of the greater good, all of it had been orchestrated by a force that views human suffering as a form of spiritual nourishment. I see now that every hero I created was actually a sacrifice offered to something that hungers for the pain of the innocent. Dumbledore whispers as his life ebbs away. Harry Potter's story is not the triumph of good over evil, but the culmination of evil's greatest victory, the transformation of love itself into a weapon against those who possess it most purely. The whisper that began this tale as a call to heroism has grown into a storm that will sweep across eternity, and I am its author. History will remember me as the greatest defender of the light, never knowing that I was actually the darkness's most successful servant. As this final memory fades, you find yourself alone in the impossible chamber, surrounded by the echoes of revelations that challenge not just your understanding of Harry Potter's story, but your comprehension of the nature of good and evil themselves. The comfortable narrative of heroism triumphing over villainy through courage and sacrifice has been revealed as the ultimate corruption, a system so perfectly disguised that even its architect believed he was serving the forces of light, while actually feeding the hunger of something far more ancient and terrible than any Dark Lord. The realization that strikes you with the force of a physical blow is that this investigation has not simply uncovered evidence of child abuse or psychological manipulation, but has revealed the existence of a form of evil so sophisticated that it convinces its servants that they are heroes and transforms acts of love into instruments of cosmic oppression. The truth you sought has indeed transformed you, just as Dumbledore's warning promised, stripping away not just your innocence but your ability to ever again see heroism, sacrifice, or love itself without recognizing the potential for corruption that lies at their heart. The weight of ultimate truth settles upon you like a burial shroud as you emerge from the deepest vault, carrying with you knowledge that no human consciousness was meant to bear. The revelation that Dumbledore's manipulation of Harry Potter was not simply the misguided action of a well-intentioned man making difficult choices, but rather the culmination of a cosmic deception that had been operating since the dawn of magical civilization, transforms your investigation from a case of historical injustice into something approaching a theological crisis. As you return to your office in the upper levels of the Department of Mysteries, you find that your perception of the magical world around you has been fundamentally altered. The gentle glow of the Lumos charms that light the corridors now seems sinister, a reminder that even the most basic magic draws its power from forces that may not have humanity's best interests at heart. The portraits that line the walls watch you with eyes that seem to hold secrets you no longer want to discover, and the very air itself feels thick with the residue of centuries of carefully orchestrated deception. The task before you now is not simply to document your findings, but to decide what to do with knowledge that could destroy the psychological foundations upon which magical society has been built. Every child who has been inspired by Harry Potter's story, every parent who has taught their children about the importance of courage and self-sacrifice, every wizard who has found hope in the narrative of good triumphing over evil, all of them have been living within an elaborate illusion created by forces that view their beliefs as tools of control rather than sources of genuine meaning. The documents spread across your desk tell a story that spans millennia, revealing that the pattern of manufactured heroes and orchestrated sacrifices extends far beyond Dumbledore's immediate manipulation of Harry Potter. Your investigation has uncovered evidence that every major crisis in magical history, every Dark Lord who has threatened civilization, every hero who has risen to meet that threat, has been part of an elaborate cycle designed to harvest the spiritual energy generated by human suffering and sacrifice. The entity that Dumbledore communicated with, which he knew only as the Necessity, appears throughout historical records under dozens of different names and manifestations. Sometimes it appears as a wise mentor, offering guidance to struggling leaders. Sometimes it manifests as a prophetic voice warning of future disasters that can only be prevented through extreme measures. Sometimes it takes the form of an ancient magical law or cosmic principle that demands balance through sacrifice. But in every case, its influence follows the same pattern. It identifies individuals with the power to shape events, convinces them that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses, and guides them towards solutions that involve the systematic suffering of innocent people in service of supposedly greater goods. The heroes and villains of magical history emerge from your investigation not as genuine expressions of human moral choice, but as puppets dancing to the tune of an entity that feeds on the emotional energy generated by their conflicts. The realization that forces you to confront the full horror of what you have discovered is that this entity's greatest success lies not in the suffering it has caused directly, but in the way it has corrupted the very concepts of goodness, heroism, and love. Every act of self-sacrifice that has been celebrated in magical history, every moment of courage that has inspired future generations, every expression of love that has been held up as an example of human nobility, has been tainted by the knowledge that these emotions and actions have been systematically cultivated and harvested by forces that view human consciousness as a renewable resource. Harry Potter's story, which seemed like the ultimate triumph of love over hate, emerges from your investigation as the most sophisticated example of this cosmic manipulation. His capacity for love was not a natural gift, but a carefully engineered vulnerability. His willingness to sacrifice himself was not a heroic choice, but a conditioned response. His survival of that sacrifice was not a miraculous reward for his virtue, but a planned outcome designed to spread his psychological conditioning to future generations. The magical phenomenon that Dumbledore called the empathy cascade, which began with Harry's sacrifice and has been spreading throughout the wizarding world ever since, is not evidence of humanity's growing capacity for goodness, but rather proof of how successfully human nature itself can be altered to serve external purposes. The children being born with enhanced empathy and willingness to sacrifice for others are not naturally more virtuous than previous generations, but are instead the products of a magical transformation that has fundamentally altered the development of human consciousness. Your investigation reveals that this transformation is accelerating, with each new generation showing increased susceptibility to the kind of psychological conditioning that was once required to create individual sacrificial heroes. The need for elaborate manipulation and systematic abuse is disappearing, because the essential qualities that once had to be artificially cultivated through trauma are now becoming natural components of magical human development. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond the wizarding world, as the documents reveal that similar patterns of manipulation have been operating in the non-magical human population as well, though through different mechanisms and with less obvious magical effects. The entity that presents itself as the necessity appears to be engaged in a multi-generational project to reshape human consciousness across all populations, using magical communities as testing grounds for techniques that are then adapted for broader application. The scope of this manipulation becomes clear as you examine records that show how cultural myths, religious beliefs, political ideologies, and social movements throughout human history have been influenced by the same patterns of artificial crisis creation and manufactured heroic response that defined Harry Potter's story. The comfortable narrative of human progress through struggle and sacrifice emerges from your investigation as perhaps the greatest deception ever perpetrated. A story told by forces that benefit from human suffering while convincing their victims that such suffering is noble and necessary. The most devastating realization comes when you understand that your own investigation, your commitment to uncovering the truth about Harry Potter's treatment, may itself be part of the larger pattern of manipulation. The very desire to seek justice for his suffering, to expose the corruption that shaped his life, to protect future children from similar abuse. All of these noble impulses may have been artificially enhanced to serve purposes that you cannot fully comprehend. The entity that feeds on human suffering would have an obvious interest in ensuring that the truth about its methods is eventually discovered, as the revelation of past deceptions creates the emotional trauma necessary to justify even more extreme measures in response. The cycle of crisis and heroic solution, of problem and sacrifice-based resolution, continues even in the process of exposing the cycle itself. This understanding forces you to confront an impossible choice. Remain silent about what you have discovered, allowing the comfortable illusions that sustain magical society to continue, while knowing that they enable ongoing manipulation and abuse, or reveal the truth and risk creating the kind of spiritual crisis that could justify even more extreme interventions by the forces you have been investigating. The documents on your desk include contingency plans created by the necessity's human servants throughout history, preparations for the moment when their methods would inevitably be discovered. These plans reveal that the exposure of past manipulations has always been anticipated and incorporated into longer-term strategies, with the crisis of faith created by such revelations being used to justify the implementation of even more comprehensive systems of control. The revelation of necessary deceptions will create the spiritual emergency that justifies total transformation, reads one document, attributed to an unnamed advisor to magical leaders throughout history. When populations discover that their heroes were manufactured and their suffering was orchestrated, they will demand protection from such manipulation. This demand will provide the justification for implementing direct control systems that eliminate the need for deception by removing the possibility of independent thought itself. The choice before you becomes not simply whether to reveal the truth about Harry Potter's story, but whether to risk enabling a form of spiritual tyranny that would make Dumbledore's psychological manipulation seem benevolent by comparison. The very act of exposing the corruption threatens to create the conditions that would justify its replacement with something far worse. Yet, as you sit in the silence of your office, surrounded by evidence of centuries of carefully orchestrated suffering, you realize that the alternative to revelation is the perpetual continuation of a system that views human consciousness as raw material to be shaped and harvested by forces that exist beyond any moral framework that humans can comprehend. The comfortable illusions that protect people from this knowledge are themselves forms of imprisonment, psychological chains that prevent them from developing the kind of genuine spiritual autonomy that might eventually free them from manipulation altogether. The resolution you reach is not a comfortable one, but rather a recognition that some truths are too important to suppress regardless of their consequences. Harry Potter's story, in all its horror and complexity, represents not just the suffering of one individual, but the culmination of patterns that have shaped human development for millennia. The exposure of these patterns may indeed create new forms of crisis and manipulation, but it also creates the possibility, however remote, that future generations might develop the wisdom and strength necessary to break free from cycles that have trapped humanity since the beginning of recorded history. Your final decision is to document everything you have discovered, but to do so in a way that emphasizes not just the horror of what has been done, but the potential for what might be accomplished if humans can learn to recognize and resist the forces that seek to control them through their own noble impulses. The truth about Harry Potter's manufactured heroism must be told, but it must be told as a warning rather than a condemnation, as an opportunity for growth rather than a reason for despair. The magical world will indeed be shattered by these revelations, but from that shattering may emerge the possibility of a form of society that values individual autonomy and genuine choice over manufactured virtue and orchestrated sacrifice. The price of such transformation will be high, as all meaningful change requires the abandonment of comfortable illusions, but the alternative is the perpetual enslavement of human consciousness to forces that view suffering as a renewable resource and love as a tool of control. As you begin the long process of preparing your final report, you understand that you are not simply documenting a historical injustice, but contributing to a conversation that will determine the future of human spiritual development. The echo of that whisper that began this investigation has indeed grown into a storm that will sweep across eternity, but whether that storm brings destruction or renewal will depend on how courageously humanity chooses to face the truth about the price that has been paid for its salvation and the forces that continue to demand that price be paid again and again. The months following the completion of your investigation pass in a strange suspension between revelation and silence as you grapple with the impossible weight of knowledge that transforms every aspect of existence into a question mark. The final report sits completed on your desk, 500 pages of meticulously documented evidence that could reshape the fundamental understanding of magical civilization, yet you find yourself unable to take the final step of submitting it to the authorities who commissioned your work. The aftermath of your discoveries has created a peculiar form of psychological limbo, where you exist simultaneously as someone who has uncovered the truth and someone who understands that truth may be too dangerous to reveal. The comfortable rhythms of daily life continue around you, ministry workers arriving each morning to pursue their orderly investigations of minor magical infractions, while you sit in possession of evidence that every major event in their world has been orchestrated by forces that view human consciousness as a commodity to be harvested and refined. The weight of this knowledge manifests itself in unexpected ways. You find yourself studying the faces of your colleagues, wondering which of their beliefs and motivations are genuine expressions of their personalities and which are the products of subtle manipulation extending back generations. The children you see playing in Diagon Alley become sources of profound sadness, as you recognize in their innocent games the echoes of conditioning that will shape them into future heroes or victims of systems they will never understand. Sleep becomes elusive, not because of nightmares, but because of the opposite. The profound emptiness that comes when you realize that even your dreams may not be entirely your own. The investigation has revealed that the magical techniques used to influence Harry Potter's unconscious mind were refined versions of methods that had been applied to entire populations over centuries. The possibility that your own psychological development has been shaped by forces beyond your awareness creates a form of existential vertigo that makes genuine rest impossible. Your attempts to find solace in the magical world's great works of literature and philosophy only deepen your sense of isolation, as you now recognize the patterns of manufactured meaning and orchestrated inspiration that run through even the most celebrated expressions of magical culture. The epic poems about heroic sacrifice that once stirred your heart now read like instruction manuals for psychological conditioning. The philosophical treatises on the nature of good and evil reveal themselves as sophisticated propaganda designed to maintain specific power structures while appearing to challenge them. The most profound challenge comes when you attempt to discuss your findings with trusted colleagues, only to discover that the very framework of language itself has been compromised by centuries of manipulation. The words you use to describe concepts like heroism, sacrifice, love, and justice carry connotations that have been carefully shaped to support the systems you are trying to expose. Every attempt at communication becomes an exercise in trying to convey revolutionary ideas using vocabulary that was designed to prevent such communication. The isolation deepens when you realize that even your closest relationships have been built upon foundations that your investigation has revealed to be artificial. The loyalty you feel toward your friends, the love you bear for your family, the commitment you have to your work, all of these emotions and attachments must now be examined for evidence of external influence. The possibility that your most cherished feelings are products of manipulation rather than authentic expressions of your nature creates a form of spiritual paralysis that makes meaningful human connection seem impossible. Yet gradually, through the long months of contemplation and analysis, a different kind of understanding begins to emerge. The recognition that your emotions and motivations may have been influenced by external forces does not necessarily invalidate them as sources of meaning and value. Even if love has been weaponized and heroism has been manufactured, the experiences themselves retain a reality and significance that transcends their origins. This realization leads you to a crucial insight. The forces that have been manipulating human consciousness for millennia may have succeeded in shaping the conditions under which people experience love and courage and sacrifice. But they have not succeeded in creating these experiences from nothing. The raw material they work with, the fundamental human capacity for connection and meaning and transcendence, appears to be something that exists independently of their influence. Harry Potter's story, even revealed in all its horror as a product of systematic psychological manipulation, still contains within it something genuinely beautiful and inspiring. His capacity to choose love despite being denied love, his willingness to protect others despite never being protected himself, his ability to find meaning in suffering and purpose in sacrifice. These qualities may have been artificially cultivated, but they were not artificially created. The manipulation succeeded because it drew upon and amplified something that was already present in human nature. This understanding begins to offer a path toward healing and integration, a way of acknowledging the reality of manipulation while still finding authentic meaning in the experiences it has shaped. The key insight is that awareness of influence is the first step toward freedom from that influence, and that consciousness of the ways in which your thoughts and feelings have been shaped can become the foundation for developing thoughts and feelings that are more genuinely your own. The process of recovery involves learning to distinguish between responses that feel imposed from without and responses that arise from something deeper and more authentic within. It requires developing new forms of discernment that can recognize the difference between genuine inspiration and manufactured emotion, between authentic moral reasoning and programmed behavioral conditioning. This inner work becomes a form of spiritual archaeology, carefully excavating the layers of external influence to discover what remains when all the manipulation has been identified and set aside. The process is neither quick nor comfortable, requiring you to question not just your beliefs and values but the very foundations of your identity as a conscious being. Gradually, you begin to develop what you come to think of as conscious feeling, a way of experiencing emotions and motivations that acknowledges their potential artificial origins, while still allowing them to serve as sources of meaning and guidance. You learn to love your friends and family not because such love is pure and uninfluenced, but because the choice to love them represents an act of authentic will regardless of how that capacity for love may have been shaped. The investigation into Harry Potter's story becomes a mirror for your own journey toward authentic consciousness, as you recognize that his greatest achievement was not his willingness to sacrifice himself for others, but his retention of the capacity for genuine choice despite 17 years of systematic conditioning. His ability to walk into the forbidden forest knowing he would die, while still maintaining some essential core of selfhood that remained his own, becomes a model for how to live with awareness of manipulation while still finding ways to act from authentic intention. This understanding transforms your relationship with the final report that sits on your desk, waiting for a decision about its fate. You begin to see the document not as a weapon that could destroy the comfortable illusions that sustain magical society, but as a tool that could help others begin their own journeys toward conscious awareness of the forces that shape their lives. The decision about whether to submit the report becomes less about protecting people from dangerous truths and more about finding ways to present those truths in forms that support growth rather than despair. The goal shifts from exposing corruption to fostering the kind of conscious development that might eventually make such corruption impossible. You begin to envision not the dramatic revelation that would shatter the wizarding world's faith in its heroes and institutions, but a gradual process of awakening that would help people develop the discernment necessary to recognize manipulation while retaining their capacity for genuine moral action. The report becomes the foundation for a longer-term project of education and consciousness raising that treats the exposure of past deceptions as the beginning of wisdom rather than its ultimate goal. The months of contemplation have taught you that the aftermath of discovering ultimate truth is not the end of the story but rather its beginning, the point at which the real work of consciousness development can finally commence. The knowledge you have gained about Harry Potter's manufactured heroism becomes not a burden to be carried in isolation but a gift to be shared with others who are ready to begin their own journeys toward authentic awareness and genuine choice. As you prepare to take the next steps in this longer process, you find yourself filled not with the despair that initially accompanied your discoveries, but with a quiet sense of hope, rooted in the recognition that human consciousness, however it may have been manipulated and shaped, retains an essential core that cannot be entirely controlled or corrupted. The whisper that began this investigation has indeed grown into a storm, but it is a storm that carries within it the seeds of a new form of human development, one based on conscious awareness rather than unconscious conditioning. The soft light of dawn filters through the windows of your study as you complete the final revisions to what has become not a report of condemnation, but a guidebook for conscious awakening. The investigation that began as an examination of historical injustice has transformed into something far more profound, a roadmap for human development that acknowledges the reality of manipulation while pointing toward the possibility of authentic freedom. The months of integration and reflection have taught you that truth, however painful, carries within itself the seeds of healing. The revelation that Harry Potter's heroism was manufactured does not diminish the reality of his courage, but rather reveals the extraordinary resilience of human consciousness under even the most extreme conditions of control. His story becomes not a tragedy of manipulation, but a testament to the indestructible core of awareness that exists within every human being, waiting to be discovered and developed. Your study has become a sanctuary of gentle contemplation, its walls lined with books that you now read with new eyes, recognizing both the wisdom they contain and the systems of influence that shaped their creation. The magical instruments that once seemed mysterious and powerful now appear as tools created by consciousness for consciousness, their ultimate value lying not in their magical properties but in their capacity to support the development of awareness and understanding. The pensieve that sits on your desk, no longer contains memories of horror and manipulation, but has been filled with moments of authentic choice and genuine connection that you have carefully identified and preserved from your investigation. These memories serve as reminders that even within systems of the most sophisticated control, human beings retain the capacity for actions that transcend their conditioning and express something essential and uncontrollable about the nature of consciousness itself. The garden visible through your window has become a source of daily meditation, its cycles of growth and decay offering lessons about the natural processes of development that continue regardless of external attempts at manipulation. You have learned to see in the patience of growing things a model for the kind of gradual awakening that represents the most sustainable form of consciousness development, one that honors both the reality of influence and the possibility of transcendence. Your correspondence with other researchers and philosophers throughout the magical world has revealed that your investigation is part of a larger awakening that has been occurring quietly for generations. Individuals throughout magical society have been developing their own forms of conscious awareness, learning to recognize and work with the influences that shape their lives, while maintaining their capacity for authentic choice and genuine meaning. This network of conscious individuals does not operate as an organization or movement, but rather as a loose collection of people who have discovered similar insights about the nature of consciousness and influence. Their communications, carried out through carefully worded letters and protected magical connections, represent a new form of magical practice based on awareness rather than power, understanding rather than control. The children of this emerging consciousness, those magical young people who have been born since Harry Potter's sacrifice began reshaping human nature, are showing remarkable abilities to recognize and work with the influences that affect their development. Rather than being victims of enhanced empathy and compulsive self-sacrifice, many of them are learning to use their increased sensitivity as tools for conscious development, becoming more rather than less capable of authentic choice. These children represent hope for a future where the patterns that created both Harry Potter's suffering and Voldemort's evil might finally be transcended through conscious awareness rather than unconscious reaction. Their development suggests that the ultimate result of your investigation may not be the exposure of past manipulations, but the emergence of new forms of human consciousness that are inherently resistant to such manipulation. The decision about the fate of your formal report has resolved itself through this longer process of understanding and integration. Rather than submitting a single document that would create crisis and confusion, you have chosen to share your insights through a gradual process of education and consciousness raising that honors people's capacity for growth, while supporting their journey toward greater awareness. The mystery sleeping societies that exist throughout the magical world have become vehicles for this sharing. Small groups of individuals who gather to explore questions of consciousness and influence through guided discussion and contemplative practice. These societies do not seek to expose or condemn the systems that have shaped magical civilization, but rather to help people develop the awareness necessary to recognize and transcend those systems through their own conscious development. The story of Harry Potter, told within these circles as a teaching tale rather than historical fact, becomes a powerful tool for helping people understand the nature of conditioning and the possibility of conscious choice. His journey from manufactured weapon to authentic human being serves as a model for the kind of development that is possible when awareness is combined with courage and persistent commitment to truth. Your own role in this emerging movement has evolved from investigator to teacher, sharing not just the facts you have discovered but the processes of discernment and conscious development that those facts have revealed to be necessary. The skills required to see through sophisticated manipulation turn out to be the same skills required for authentic spiritual development. The ability to observe your own thoughts and feelings with clarity, the courage to question assumptions and examine beliefs, and the persistence to continue seeking truth even when that truth challenges everything you thought you knew. The magical practices that emerge from this work are fundamentally different from traditional magic, being based on consciousness rather than will, understanding rather than power, and integration rather than transcendence. These practices treat magic not as a force to be wielded for external purposes, but as a reflection of consciousness that can be used to support the development of awareness and authentic choice. The peaceful revolution that grows from your investigation operates not through dramatic confrontation with existing systems, but through the quiet development of individuals who gradually become less susceptible to manipulation and more capable of genuine moral action. The change spreads not through propaganda or persuasion, but through the natural influence of people who have learned to think and feel and choose from sources that are authentically their own. As you sit in your study watching the sunrise paint the world in gentle colors, you reflect on the journey that has brought you to this point of quiet understanding. The investigation that began with anger about injustice has led to compassion for all beings caught in systems they did not create and do not understand. The search for someone to blame has evolved into appreciation for the complexity of consciousness and the difficulty of authentic development in a world shaped by countless influences. The story of Harry Potter continues to unfold, not as a completed narrative of heroism and sacrifice, but as an ongoing teaching about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of authentic choice. His legacy lies not in the specific actions he took or the particular enemies he defeated, but in his demonstration that even under the most extreme conditions of manipulation and control, human consciousness retains something essential that cannot be entirely shaped or directed by external forces. The night that brought you this investigation has given way to a new dawn, one illuminated by the understanding that consciousness itself is the ultimate magic, the force that gives meaning to all other forces, and the source from which genuine transformation must arise. The whisper that began your journey has indeed grown into a storm, but it is a storm of awakening rather than destruction, one that sweeps away illusions not to create emptiness, but to make space for something more authentic and beautiful to emerge. In the gentle morning light, surrounded by the evidence of humanity's capacity for both manipulation and transcendence, you find yourself filled with quiet gratitude for the journey that has led to this understanding. The truth about Harry Potter's story, however painful, has become a gift that keeps giving, offering ever deeper insights into the nature of consciousness and the possibilities that await those who choose awareness over unconsciousness, authentic development over comfortable illusion. The investigation is complete, but the awakening it has fostered continues, spreading quietly through the magical world like seeds carried on the wind, taking root wherever they find consciousness ready to recognize that freedom begins with understanding and that understanding begins with the courage to see things as they truly are, without the comfortable filters of assumption and belief. As you close the final page of your notes and look out at a world transformed by your new vision, you understand that this ending is really a beginning, the start of a new chapter in the story of human consciousness that will be written, not by the forces that seek to control and manipulate, but by individuals who have learned to think and feel and choose from the deepest sources of authentic awareness within themselves. The magical world sleeps peacefully around you, dreaming dreams that may still be influenced by ancient patterns of control, but within that sleep, new forms of consciousness are stirring, ready to awaken to possibilities that transcend both the comfortable illusions of the past and the sophisticated manipulations that created them. The future remains unwritten, awaiting the choices of those who have learned to choose consciously, with full awareness of both their limitations and their infinite potential for authentic growth and genuine transformation.